Welcome to Safe on Deck. For episode 43, I sat down with Lieutenant Commander Andy Phelps at his home in Fairhope, Alabama. After earning his commission via the Navy Reserve Officer Training Corps program, Lieutenant Commander Phelps completed primary and advanced flight training before being selected to fly the F-18F Super Hornet at Strike Fighter Squadron 211, the fighting checkmates aboard Naval Air Station Oceana. Next, Lieutenant Commander Phelps was handpicked to transition to the F-35C Lightning II, where he served as an operational test pilot at Air Test and Evaluation Squadron 9, Det Edwards, working to expand the jet's weapons capabilities and integration into the Naval Aviation Enterprise. In 2023, Lieutenant Commander Phelps joined the Navy Reserve, where he flies the T-45C Goshawk, instructing the next generation of Navy and Marine Corps tailhook aviators. Thanks for taking the time to listen. In the future, I plan to continue to share similar interviews with both current and retired military aviators. If you have a question or a suggestion for a future interview, please leave it as a comment below. Safe on Deck, episode 43, with Lieutenant Commander Andy Phelps. Enjoy. Andy, I've been really looking forward to getting a chance to sit down. Thank you for making the time to make it happen. One of the things that we share, and hopefully we'll talk about it maybe at the end of the interview, is a great passion for general aviation. So we met out at Hampton Roads Airport in Norfolk and did a little bit of GA flying out there together. But before we get to that, again, that'll probably be the end. Let's start at the very beginning. So where were you born?
Born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I should have started off too with happy to sit down here with you. Finally got the time to do it after the clashing of getting out of the Navy, starting work at airlines and things like that. So this is cool to sit down here. My journey starts, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Grew up there and stayed there pretty much the entire time that I was in my childhood. My father was also in the Navy. The idea of joining the Navy was always there from a young age, but I've been around aviation for as long as my first memory is. My mom's from Ohio and my dad's from Virginia Beach, Virginia, essentially. Actually from Norfolk, but when we would go and visit our grandparents, we'd be driving to Ohio or we'd be flying down to Norfolk. So he worked for US Air. I did like the non-rev lifestyle the entire time growing up from my young age. So aviation was always there.
Very cool. You said the Navy. What did he do in the Navy?
He was an S3 pilot.
No way.
Yeah, flew for the Navy for the longest time. And I guess from being down at Norfolk, it kind of makes sense when the Navy has such a big presence down there that I know his father, he tells stories about his father taking him to the airport and they would be watching any of the planes landing in Norfolk International. And this is like the coming of the jet age where they're seeing the new airplanes and everything like that. So it was always a kind of a part of him as well. But as much as I know, he was the first one to actually fly airplanes in the family there. So it's funny that he saw that aspect of all these airplanes flying around him. And for me, that was the only life that I knew growing up, was basically just being around airplanes the whole time.
Very cool. Okay, what was the path into the Navy for you? What was your commissioning source?
So mine was ROTC, and it's kind of odd because it wasn't like I went to college. It's like, I'm definitely going to the Navy. It actually turned into hey, I think I want to be an airline pilot like my dad. I was originally looking at schools for engineering because that was always I was more of the math guy than I was more of the liberal arts kind of person growing up. As I went through some of the schools and looking at some of the different options, Purdue showed up in one of those schools. I was going through engineering, and I scrolled past some of the different engineering degrees, and I saw professional flight technology. That led down another road of being like, I can go to college to become an airline pilot, and looked a little bit more into it at Purdue. Realized, cool, that is an option for me. I want to be an airline pilot, so this is the path that we should probably take. And then it took me one semester when I was there to recognize that like the airlines will always be an option later on down in life. Most of the friends that I made were in ROTC, and specifically even the Navy. So it kind of came at no surprise when after hanging out with these guys for a while, and they're all talking about like the planes that they're going to want to fly in the Navy and all these different cool things, and you start looking at all these accolades, and it kind of started to dawn on me that like the best thing in my mind, the pinnacle aviation achievement would be to fly jets off of aircraft carriers. From there, it was like literally the first semester at Purdue, I went over to the armory that they have on campus there, talked to the lieutenant there that was the aviation instructor, and kind of just told him my backstory. The neat thing was I was doing well enough in school at that point that for them, it's very easy to affiliate you into the ROTC unit. And then they're like, hey, we'll put you on a path for a scholarship and all these different things. And I was like, okay, this is awesome. All I want to do is fly, but like, yeah, sure, I'll take money to go to college too. And spend some time with them. And then the second semester I was enrolled in Purdue's ROTC program and took that through the fruition. But this was about the 2009 timeline, was my freshman year in college. So 2010, about when I was applying for scholarships and whatnot, is when sequestration started hitting. One of the first places that the Navy pulled money from was scholarship funds for non-scholarship students. So people that, like me, that came in without a scholarship into the RTC program and then looked to then get a scholarship through a commissioning. And that money dried up. So I've got a couple different stories that kind of go down a path of, hey, you're being a super high performer. And, the things that they tell you to be as a midshipman is, do studies first, because like grades is the most important thing when it comes out to breaking out almost on where you'll end up being. Granted, like your health is important, your ASTB scores and all that stuff too. But when the grades are good, it makes it a lot easier for them to go to bat for you. But they just didn't have money. So I ended up going through college, never actually getting to the point where I was on scholarship. But what was funny was, as one of those things to try and get a scholarship and raise like your social credit, if you will, through ROTC, I would do these recruiting events. And we actually were standing next to the Army recruiter. And so there was a major there as one of the instructors. And I started telling him my story about how I'm in the flight program and I'm looking to fly in the Navy, but don't have any money, or they're not offered scholarships. And then he basically, well, have you thought about flying for the Army? And it wasn't until like literally that second that I recognized, hey, there's another option between flying for the Navy. And so I entertained that for a little bit. The long story short of it is he got me to go to, this was after my sophomore year in college, he got me to go to a course called Leadership Training Course, LTC. It's in Fort Knox, and they basically run you up to speed over like what you would have missed the first 2 years of ROTC experience in the Army, and then rolled you into your junior year back up to speed with everybody else. And the cool thing was, like, hey, the Army, we got plenty of money, man. So if you want to try and take an option over here, we'll look to follow that through, and end up getting a scholarship going through the Army that way. But then it's funny, like I did all these things without reaching out. You know, some of the things that the Navy teaches you to reach out, find some gals from guys that have gone through this path before you. And having not learned that by that point in my life, I'm just like, oh, that sounds like a good idea. This guy's telling me this, I'll go do it. Had a decent experience. I can tell I definitely didn't want to be an infantry officer, which is what a lot of that LTC training was kind of conducting you towards. And now the details are a little bit hazy in terms of what the different options for selection are for aviation versus not aviation in the Army. And the long story short of it was that there are a lot of other things that the Army does other than fly. So I don't want to throw the number out there. Let's say like 10% of their officers, probably even less, are the ones that actually get those aviation spots, and they become so highly coveted that the chances of becoming an aviation officer could be dashed with just one wrong misstep, and then now you're at the bottom of like the evaluation queue or something along those lines. So fortunately, I was in a position where I wasn't worried as much about the funding. It wasn't like I needed to have the scholarship to be able to make or break it and go forward with it. But I ended up staying with the Navy. They were able to give me just a small stipend for books and food, but not the full-blown scholarship. But then ultimately went through there, and ultimately, to me, looking back on it, I wouldn't have changed anything on how I made the decisions in life, and got me basically to the point where I don't know how familiar you are necessarily with the ROTC pickings of after your sophomore year, you basically commit to the Navy, but the Navy doesn't even tell you what you'll be doing for them, whether that's a submarine officer or a surface warfare officer or aviation, until like your senior year. So having already established a reputation in the Navy ROTC program for 2 years, now 3 years essentially, when I said that I was going to, commit to the Navy even without that money, and then line yourself up with a much better chance of going for the pilot spot. And then on top of that, like the flying I still wanted to do was off of an aircraft carrier, and it's kind of hard to pull that nugget out of you. So long short of it is, got the aviation selection out of Purdue, kind of went to Pensacola, and that was the end of my ROTC experience. No crazy stuff in the middle of it, but it was almost funny how had fate gone a slightly different way. If the Army would have guaranteed me an aviation spot, I'm curious where my life would have gone after that. But we might get into it. My first skipper when I was in the VFA 211 was actually a former Black Hawk pilot, and ended up going into the Navy and became an F-14 pilot in the Navy afterwards. So I could talk to him about the little bit of experience I had in the Army, which was just the 4 weeks of being yelled at in Fort Knox.
When did you get to Pensacola and start API?
I started API, so it would have been May in 2013.
2013.
Yep.
Okay.
And then by doing the Purdue's aviation program, I was a validator. So I don't know what they're doing now. I'm kind of lost it, whether they're sending everybody through. I think that's what it is. Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah, the term from when you and I went through validator, you were able to skip IFS, so the initial like 15 or 20 hours in a Cessna. You went right to the API portion. Now with Knife, everyone does the flying in the Cessna and then the ground work.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. I remember being pretty naive at the time when I showed up, being like, I could have 15 free hours flying in 172. Like, why did I tell them I had a license? And then you look back on it, and like what it ended up saving me ultimately, I think, was probably 3 months, almost 4 months of waiting around to start flight school. And everybody, when they first join the Navy and they get an A-pull, it's the greatest thing ever, where you're just being paid to show up and muster, or even just over the phone muster in the morning. Living in Pensacola, it's not a bad life. Looking back on everything now, and anybody who's going up in those kind of spots, I know it's not out of their control, but man, the quicker you get through training, the more options you have later on. And I'm sure a lot of your other guests have been talking about this too, is like the timing is everything. And the earlier you get some of these criteria done, the more options there are down the road. Literally, I was there at API in May, started, and then classed up, I think, the middle of June. So just under a month of waiting. But that included, at the time too, we did DeVolsi. So a week and a half of that was you were dedicated doing something else, another 2 weeks of medical screening stuff to make sure everything was okay. And then I had basically the min-sit time before they assigned me a API class, and we were off to the races.
DeVolsi, for those who haven't heard the term, Division Officer Leadership Course. So for me, that was post FRS actually, and we did it in Norfolk. So it's interesting how the timelines have changed and the pipelines have changed.
Yeah. And now that you mention that, I think there were a few of my friends going through the early days of the F-18 where I recognized, oh yeah, you didn't do DeVolsi yet. Same thing with SEER school. We'll get to that too. Is there are some guys that changed their timing and when they went to SEER and whatnot. So it is funny just in the matter of 2 years what stuff changes.
Were you a Corpus guy or were you a Whiting guy?
Corpus
Corpus by the sea. Beautiful Corpus by the sea. Yeah. What was Corpus like?
I enjoyed it a lot. I know there are some people that like to throw a lot of shade that way, but I had more time waiting in Corpus to start flying. So I got there mid-July, and I think my first flight wasn't until January of 2014. So like 6-ish months later. So I actually got my sailing license while I was out there. I've always heard people are talking about Corpus as one of the best places to learn how to sail. There's always like a decent amount of wind going over the bay and whatnot. I figured, I'm in the Navy. I might as well learn to do this thing that everybody else learns how to do. And so I got the sailing license, and I can tell you if I remember a tick from attack or jibbing from jabbing or just avoiding that thing as it swings around. And all I remember is pointing out to a dummy we throw in the water, and we have to like go back, turn around and pick them up. But long story short, I don't trust myself to sail anymore by myself. But that was one of the things I had time at the time to do is play around and see what kind of stuff was there. Went to a lot of the ice race games. So it was a good experience. And again, I don't think I would change it one way or the other. I'm sure living around Pensacola, going to Whiting is a pretty awesome area to be into. And Pensacola is pretty decent. We'll get to it, I guess, here at some point. I'm now living in Mobile, essentially, in the east side of the bay. So I'm back down at Pensacola area. Clearly, I love it. But Corpus was good to me, that's for sure.
That's awesome. Were you a T-34 guy or T-6 guy?
I was one of the first T-6 guys.
Really?
So yeah, it was that period of time where we didn't have a hangar because they were in the middle of renovating them all. So we were in one of those temporary but permanent mobile trailers, if you know what I'm talking about. Like we had them literally on the apron that was out there, the parking ramp, and it was, you just walk around. You could literally feel the floor giving out under you as you're walking around. And VT-28 was still flying the T-34 while we were there. And so I was probably, I can't remember now, it might have been like the third or the fourth class of T-6 students down in Corpus. But now keep in mind, Corpus transitioned after Whiting, so the airplane was around for a while, and there was a decent amount of students that had already gone through the T-6 syllabus before. But we were some of the first from VT-27, which is a squadron that I was at, which was kind of in our benefit as a student because a lot of the instructors were flying the airplane with almost the same amount of hours that we'd show up with too in that airplane, which is, and I think later on too, like I was the student with 50 hours in the airplane and you were being assigned instructors that had just got their NATOP squal and whatever initial instructor certificate, and that was it. So I think there were even some examples of me as a student having more hours in the T6 than the instructor. At a time, like you're just so locked on to what you're training that you don't think about those things.
You mentioned carrier aviation. Do you already have your focus in that direction? You want to be a tailhook guy?
Yeah, I did. And the cool thing for my experience being there was I had a Marine Harrier pilot was my on-wing, and a lot of the times is the actual instructor side generally fell on the helicopter and P8, P3 route. So it was more of a rarity to find a TAC air guy. I think we only had one Navy F-18 guy that was there. The rest of the instructors, if they had any jet experience, were Marines. So I got lucky. My on-wing was a Harrier guy, so I didn't have to explain why I wanted to fly jets. A lot of my other peers that were out there, like you either really wanted it or you kind of didn't. And if you didn't, the instructors weren't going to steer you in the direction towards going to jets. Some of them were a lot more transparent about it, and other ones basically flat out would start talking to you about like, oh no, you don't want to go jets. Like that lifestyle's rough, yada, yada, yada. And like as a student, you don't try to rock the boat. So I do look at it as a disadvantage. Like looking back on it now, man, I wish there were guys that like you could feel comfortable walking up to and asking those questions and getting the right answers, because I feel like I was I knew I wanted to fly off a carrier, so it was good for me. But if there was somebody on the fence, man, there were probably questions that they were not going to have answered in an honest way that were steering in the right direction.
That's interesting, and it's so valuable to have good voices at that level. I kind of smiled. No one can see it but you, but I kind of smiled when you said Marine Harrier pilot. I had one experience with the Marine Harrier pilot when I was at VT6, and it was my initial check ride. And it's not because I failed the check ride. There was like a window between check ride and solo, and you had to solo within 5 days or something. And it was right before the holidays. They didn't have an airplane for me, and so I waited. And I came back from the holidays, did another check ride. Same thing happened. The third time around, I finally, the instructor was like, wait, didn't I give you a check ride like 3 weeks ago? I'm like, yes, sir, you did. So anyway, that was the third one. I saw it. Everything was fine. But the first one was a Marine Harrier guy. And he yelled at me from the chocks to when we got back in the chocks. And I remember,
nice.
Yeah, it was a bespoke experience to say the least. I do remember at the end, I think he could tell that he'd finally made me mad because all of a sudden he stopped yelling in the same way he'd been yelling before. And in the debrief, I just basically was like, did I pass or did I fail, man? I get it. But anyway, all that to say, it's so important that I think at that primary level, hopefully folks have good experiences. I, as a primary instructor, I always try to carry that meaning with me. And I know something you carry with you as an instructor in the jet as well. Like, in many cases, this is the first time this person has done something, the first time they've seen it. They're going to probably have a little bit of a learning curve. That's what we all did, right? But if you're a dick about it, it's going to make it a lot more challenging for that student to, again, no one knows what I just did today. I just got my equivalency exam for a civilian flight instructor. And it's funny because there's, all the FAA way of doing things. And it's funny, the way they talk about the instructor-student relationship and all this stuff. And in many ways, it's almost counter to the way we do it in the military. Not to say that we do it in the military in the wrong way, but it's very interesting to see, the air quotes, the right way, the way you're supposed to have that relationship. And then sometimes if you have a great instructor, that's exactly what they're going to do almost unconsciously. And maybe sometimes that's not what you're going to have if it's somebody else. So anyway, I'm rambling way too much, but I'm glad you had a good experience with your Marine Harrier instructor pilot. That's awesome.
I'd say mine was probably the exact opposite of that one, where like there wasn't a single time in the instructor mindset where I didn't feel like he was trying to be helpful in every single way, which was awesome. I never had the weird experience of somebody asking, well, why do you really want to fly jets, man? Like there's a different story here. It just helped out. And what was interesting too is my on-wing was also working there at the wing. So it was this kind of weird relationship where there was like your granddaddy on-wing that was there as well. And so to me, like right off the bat, there was this camaraderie mindset that necessarily hadn't experienced up to that point. But like here were two guys. There was a Navy commander that was the on-wing to the captain Marine that I had. And then here we are as an 01 flying around too. And to have like a somewhat personal relationship outside where like, you know, they invited us all over to hang out, get to like chill a little bit, and here you as a student. It was an awesome experience.
How did you find out when, obviously, spoiler alert, you went tailhook from here, but how did you find out? At 27, was it a ceremony? Was it, they just slid a piece of paper across the table? Did they call you? How'd you find out?
I want to say that I know for certain they pulled us into the skipper's office and we shared a beer. And he was the one that officially told us like what you got. And we were done for like a week too. So it wasn't like it was you flew, you walked into the skipper's office, he told you what we had. I do remember it being we had our last flight. And there was a couple days to chill for a little bit. And then you're assigned to come into the skipper's office and he announced what you had. But if I'm being perfectly honest, I'm pretty certain that I got a text from my on-wing as like hey man, it ain't official, but it's pretty damn official. Congrats, you're going the way you want to go, or something along those lines. So then you show up to the skipper and he's like, I'm sure you already know, like they're in on this too. As a good skipper would probably know, they recognize like where the relationships are with their students. And if you find a good relationship between an on-wing and the student, I think that's something that is pretty important. It makes me feel bad now I haven't reached out to him in like probably years. So we get along well. So I should probably text him. He doesn't even know I've gotten out at some of those things. But
oh, wow. That's really cool. I mean, again, it's good to have that great relationship. Were you moving forward, Meridian or Kingsville? Where'd you go, east or west for jets?
Kingsville, because it made it easy. All my friends were basically that went to tailhook pretty much went to Kingsville almost exclusively. And then at that point, it was just easy to make a 40-minute move instead of going all the way out. I was at this point in my life, like I'm just here to go to flight school and I'm not trying to get the best deal out of each thing or like, in hindsight, definitely, I think the right move is just, you know, you find the people that you know, the support group that you do have, work through over there, and then it was just super easy to go over the 45 minutes to get over to Kingsville. I felt like I was more busy from a flying standpoint in Kingsville than I was in Corpus, such that like I showed up and within the first month you started the syllabus versus like having the 6 months of wait around time like I did for the T6 over at VT27. So I was a VT22 guy, Golden Eagle, and we started with like a bunch of other kids that were, well, also kids, a bunch of other guys that we ended up winging with. I just got selected with out of primary. So to me, it was like the natural progression from graduating primary, but still following most of the guys that you were with before into like the next phase of training. It was pretty seamless in my end. And by living already in South Texas, like we still ended up going out to Corpus a good bit on weekends. So really wasn't much of a change there from that mindset.
First jet, right? T-45A, or it would have been a C model.
Yeah, C. Yeah, okay. We were all C's by that point. I forget when they transitioned over from the A. I do know that my on-wing was talking about, because like once he found out that we were going there, we talked over like some of the things that he talked about, his first carrier landing experience in the A. And that's when I learned that the A model doesn't have as far as I remember, it doesn't have a velocity vector in the HUD. And a lot of people tend to become a cripple pretty quickly to that velocity vector. And so to think trying to land on a boat for the first time without even having a velocity vector is a pretty different experience altogether too. And I'm sure there's plenty of other people listening to this podcast being like, God damn, dude, like this is how we land on the boat every single time. And you're talking about not having a velocity vector. And like, yeah, I mean, kind of.
It is kind of humbling to think back that people landed tail dragger, reciprocal engine prop planes on carriers.
Yeah,
it's a significantly different world now for sure.
That's true.
Very cool. Okay, so what was the T-45 like? Was it a good platform as that first jet?
Yeah. I mean, up at this point, because I did a lot of the training stuff at Purdue, like I had been pretty well versed in a lot of like aviation stuff by that point. Like they obviously get you ready to become an airline pilot. Purdue's thing is you graduate from school, be a CFI for 1,000 hours, and then we apply and get you into the regionals or something. So when it came to the flying, I felt like I was above the learning curve from everybody else. And it was a decent place to be in to kind of pay back that knowledge that you had with other students that were struggling with some of those things. So that happened in primary with a lot of the instrument stuff. Like I felt like I had something to help out with people. So I did that one. I kind of take that to the nth degree at the T-45, and I tried to find people that didn't fully understand why they're spinning this radial in there, why I dialing this thing. And like some people, and I'm not even kidding when I say that, they literally would ask, hey, I know you how to fly instruments. This is the event I'm doing tomorrow. Can you tell me a step-by-step gouge what I need to do to fly this profile from Kingsville over to Harlington and back? And like they wanted to know, I'm going to spin in this frequency and this radio. I'm going to tune in this radial. I'm going to then switch over there and I'm going to identify it via this one, like to the 5Ts, everything. And I was like, I think it's better off if we actually teach you like why you're doing all these things. And I say all this to get to the point where I thought the T-45 was the most god-awful way of flying an instrument airplane in the face of the earth. Like, it is extremely hard to keep in trim. And I'm saying all this stuff as like, people find out later, and being a reserve instructor over at Meridian. But I remember as a student, like knowing how to fly instruments, but remembering it being not the most trivial thing in the world to fly instruments on an airplane that like was actively hard to keep in trim. And because it is still a high maneuvering aircraft, like you could look down at your paper charts and other people are going to laugh at the same paper charts in the cockpit for like 4 or 5 seconds looking up and you're at like a 6-degree angle of bank. It was a humbling aircraft to fly for sure. And that's what I remember about everything else on that one. And not to mention that, like, since it's their first jets, the students, I mean, you're hanging on by like the tail end of the stab, if not already falling out behind it, as that thing's already 5,000 feet and moving away from you at the speed of 300 knots or something. But very quickly, I mean, the Navy training has been the Navy training for a while. They know how to get you up to speed. So it was only a few months before he's like, okay, cool, I'm starting to feel comfortable now with flying instruments. And then now you're in FAMs, and they start to do all this stuff, and they're throwing EPs at you left and right. And as soon as you start, okay, maybe I got a good grasp of what's going on. Oh, here you come forms now, and I'm trying to figure out how to do this while I have another airplane next to me. I do remember, this is just kind of going off topic a little bit, I remember one small story, only being in the jet for maybe 50, 60 hours. And then, so you're in the form syllabus, and part of the forms is like, you're just flying parade on other airplanes, flying through clouds and IMC. I remember having the distinct thought that here you are flying 60 hours in this airplane. And I, as a student, I'm soloing and I'm flying on the wing of my instructor, and we're going through clouds down to like a 500-foot minimums, and then we're going to break out underneath it. But like the fact that the military expects you to be able to fly form at less than 50, 60 hours flying this airplane is a testament to the program that they have built, and they understand that like here's what traditionally it takes to get somebody to that level, and they go through there. Imagine what aviation insurance agency is going to sit around here and insure something like that at a different level, like let alone flying form in IMC, and here you are doing it in a jet that is worth more than your life at that point in the Navy. So
what was the boat like?
That was a unique experience, and everyone's got their own going through there. For mine specifically, our boat was the USS Eisenhower. The hashtag cool family story to that one was the boat that my dad served on for the majority of his time in VS-31. So when he found out that my first trap was going to be on the USS Eisenhower, it was pretty cool to have a little bit of a bond there on that aspect of it. The other thing that was interesting was my very first trap on a U.S. Naval aircraft carrier was on my 25th birthday to the day. So it's one of those birthdays that you always remember, which is a pretty unique experience. Like, they didn't plan that or anything. In fact, there was some weather that delayed a lot of the stuff, so it just happened to fall in that direction. I mean, it was super surreal. Our boat was off the coast of Beaufort, so that's where they based our detachment, and we went to Beaufort. Most people go to sometimes Key West or San Diego or Norfolk, but ours was really off the coast of Beaufort. And the weather was bad. They rack and stack you in priority order of the people that they want to get done. And so between the two squadrons, probably close to 30 students, I was priority number 11 in one of the squadrons. So to say I'm like the bottom 3/4 or 2/3 of the priority, so not very high up at all. And the weather started off in the dead as pretty bad. So they basically started prioritizing all like the Fox 1s and Echo 1s, I think is what, now I'm trying to go back on. I think the VT-21s, their priorities were Echo. And VT-22, our priorities were Fox. And I remember being Fox 11 out of like Fox 14 or something like that. Another tangent, you have stupidly long ball call where like you had to put a Fox number at the end of it too. So you have a student who's not really knowing how to fly around a boat, but then trying to remember this ball call that's, 200 Goshawk ball, 1.8 Fox 11, and like, oh, my mind's still at the 180. But I'm pretty late on that priority list, and so they keep saying, oh yeah, Fox is 8 up, like you guys aren't flying tomorrow, just as a heads up. So we go up to Savannah, or we go, I guess, down to Savannah or up to Charleston and spend some of those times. And it was interesting because the timing started to get towards the end of the det. So you're like, there's only so many flying days left, and you need at least 2 at the time to finish T-45 quals. I forget how many traps and how many cats it was, but like you had to do it over 2 days. So you either went to the boat, you spent overnight on the boat, then you did stuff on the second day, or you went out to the boat and they launched you back to the shore, or you swapped out with somebody else and they went back, but you couldn't do it all in one day. So it gets down to the end of the point and it's like, hey, there's only 2 more flying days left and the weather's still not great, so we're probably not going. I remember going out with like all of us bottom priority dudes out to, I think it was Savannah. And sure enough, like it's kind of one of those things, like you can't triple stamp and double stamp unless you're on like a Navy detachment. And then there's only one way to get all the X's done left. And it's like, oh, by the way, when we said that you guys aren't flying, like we're going to put you on like the 6 a.m. flight tomorrow. So you want to talk about ORM risk on this aspect of it, but like you're not going to be that student that's going to call and be like, well, you guys told us we weren't actually flying. So can we spend more time in Savannah? Like that wasn't the thing. So drove back up there to go start the 6 a.m. flight, and the weather was better than what it was originally anticipated to be. And we flew out to the boat. And the only thing I remember is, well, I remember a lot of things. I remember this specific thing, which was dialing in the TACAN in the aircraft. And then like, sure enough, that little TACAN symbol pops up 100 miles off the coast. You're like, well, shit, that thing's actually there. Now it's getting a little more real. And you're flying off the wing of an instructor. So it's an instructor and I think 3 solo students that are going out there. And we're flying over the water, and the undercast layer is basically borderline between broken and scattered, if not even actually broken and borderline overcast. Like it wasn't super great, and you couldn't see the majority of the water. You did not see. But as luck would have it, you fly over that little tack-in symbol as it shows up on your map. You look down out the window, and I can't remember if they told you like, hey, don't look. It's it's going to only intimidate you more. But I'm certain some of the students, like, I'm not going to look at it because I don't want to see what it looks like. But like, how do you resist that temptation? I challenge any of the pilots out there to be like, oh yeah, I didn't actually look at it. So you get close to that little symbol, and then you look out their canopy, and sure enough, there's like a hole just big enough in the clouds to fit an aircraft carrier. And at 20 whatever thousand feet we were at, like that carrier, it's a rowboat. Like it's not big at all. So that was the next hit. It was like you dial in attack in, oh crap, the thing's there. Then you look out there and oh crap, visually it's there. And then you get a little bit of time to cool off, because I remember being up at 20-some thousand feet, and eventually they come up and they tell you to Charlie, which is the call that they make when the boss, the tower boss, is like, okay, I'm ready to recover you guys now. Charlie's the comm. And that's when your blood really starts rushing up, where, okay, this is like the go time, and you're flying off the wing of your lead who's coming down there. And at this point, you know what to do. I mean, you've been flying that stuff for the last 50, 60 hours that we're talking about. Like by that point, you're already flying in through IMC on the wing. We come down there, and another testament towards like the Navy standardization of training is like they spend, and I forget the number again, and I'm certain some T-45 instructors are going to be like, what the hell are you smoking, man? But it's like you land 750 times in an FCLP configuration before they'll even like send you to the boat. And even then, like halfway through training, because you do the boat towards the end, but even halfway through T-45 training, they do like a mid-phase bounce stage where like you just do event after event after event after event bouncing around the land. And the cool thing about it is that they line you up to a runway that has the same dimensions of the carrier. It's painted the same way. It's all offset from the centerline box. I mean, you see it, of course, at Pensacola all the time. So it's the same dimensions. They use the same landing aid that you're going to have at the ship. It's right next to you. And when you're going through CQ phase at the end, the same exact landing signals officer, or LSO, that is with you in training and talking you down into the wire, I'll give air quotes here that the viewers can't see, on land, is the same exact voice that you have on that day when you go out to the carrier. So it might seem like there is a whole lot of stuff going on to a student who is going there for the very first time, and there's a whole lot going on. But when they line you up, it's their lead's responsibility to get you to a proper beam at the right distance, at the right speed, so that everything that happens from that 180 or, downwind next to a beam, the intended landing point there, everything else happens the way that you had practiced it that 750 times prior. And when you roll out and you go wings level, there is a runway in front of you that looks familiar. There is a landing aid, the ball that's next to you, that looks exactly like it did at the ship. And it reacts pretty close to what it does during the land, with the exception of like some of the burble and different wind stuff that's on there. But like, that's to be expected. They brief you up on that stuff. And the guy that's saying Roger Ball is the exact same voice that you've had 200, 300 times prior. So you were in your element. Like, I was surprised at how quickly you just go back into, like, people always talk about, oh, the Navy trains you super well, or the military trains you super well, standardized. This was probably the best example that I can think of where you just fall back into a training mindset. And since you've done it 750 times, it makes sense. You know how to react to it. You're reacting the same way with the same calls. Like, they've got it figured out. That being said, the passes were still dog shit, and the ball was super heavy and coming down every single time because my power management was just horrid.
When you say heavy, what does that mean?
With the ship I think it was doing a lot of its own wake that day, so it has to steam faster to allow the winds over deck. I'm not sure how much you had discussion before with previous folks, but like the wind over deck requirements for training T-45s is a lot more stringent, right? You need to have like the most ideal conditions. Like, they're not going to send you out there in bad weather days where there's more of a crosswind. Now, granted, like, here's the quip from Air Force versus the Navy is like, we never land in crosswinds, right? Because the boat just turns and puts the wind down where it needs to be. But some days there's no wind, right? And we still need to have, again, air quotes, wind over the deck to meet the actual landing speed, be within the specs of the arresting gear itself. So you can't have the boat just sitting dead in the water and then having an aircraft come into it essentially 25 knots faster than what you'd expect it to be. And that puts a lot more energy in, like, whatever the nerd equations are about mass and mass velocity squared or whatever those energy stuff is. Like, you have 25 extra knots, but you square that's a lot more energy going into the resting gear. So, and not to mention, it's just safer too when you're coming over the deck, going a little bit slower, and you have a little bit more time to react, like things like that. So if there's not enough natural wind, the ship has to be moving to make that wind for you. And when the ship is moving, it's pushing the air. This is how my brain has to understand it. It's pushing that air out of the way. And that air goes around the tower and then goes to the back of the ship and then gets sucked down behind the back of the ship due to low pressure. And you, with your slightly underpowered engine in your T-45, if you're not on top of it and ready for it, that air rush that's going down on the backside of the carrier is going to bring you and your aircraft with it. That being said, it's not that much, and paddles are doing a great job. Paddles, being the LSOs, are doing a great job at making sure that they put you in the right piece of sky that keeps you safe, even if you encounter this burble and they know it's going to catch you around. They're not going to let you show up to a low approach where that burble is going to put you in a spot that's actually really dangerous. So you kind of learn it by the first couple passes when you just get sucked down and you land well in front of the 1 wire, which is not good because you're aiming for that 3 wire generally. Ours is a 4 wire boat, so we want to try and tag the 3 or the 4. But really what Paddles wants is a more stable and predictable ball flying. They could care kind of less about which wire you hit as long as you are applying the principles that they taught you those 750 times before you show up. So if you're giving them a predictable flight pattern, you're flying the game plan pass, which is bumping it up and then flying a proactive ball and not letting it crash down and close. They're going to be happy with it, and you're going to qual. You don't need to be King Kong and get your okay passes, okay being the best grade essentially for what you're expecting, and nailing the 3 and the 4 the entire time. That being said, they're going to look for improvement, and for me, the first couple passes I make, I get caught with that burble, and you're behind the power curve, and then you can't spin the turbine up fast enough to catch up to it, and you're just going to come falling down with that air into that prior to the 1 and taxi 1. So kind of stepping back though, the first time you come about, you do hookup pass. So you come at the carrier a couple times with the hookup before you actually do for real the hook down pass. And I think, if I'm remembering, my gas was such that I didn't get the second hookup pass. Actually, I think what happened is maybe they just said, okay, that would have been a trap, so your next one's a hook down. Like if they look at you would have bolted or that was a bad pass, they were going to have you, okay, come around for another hookup pass. So I get my touch and go done. They give the thumbs up to the tower being like, hey, that would have been your trap. So say it was 100. I think that was actually my aircraft that day. It was 100 hook down this pass. So you lower the hook and you have a slight moment there when the hook comes down being like, oh crap, this is it. Like this is the one that we're actually doing. And unbeknownst to me this whole time, the aircraft carrier had the 2 and the 3 wire stripped. And it doesn't change how you fly behind the boat because they still want you to fly the same way you would. And they want you to, fly into, in this case, they were targeting the 3. So it's still like the same game plan pass that they want you to fly. So they don't tell you any of these things. They don't tell you that, hey, we got the 2 and 3 wire strip because it doesn't matter. You're not changing the way that you're flying the airplane. But that's going to be a little bit of a surprise later on. You'll find out as we come around the pass here is I slightly high, I think, when I was getting close, and then had a pretty bad high come down at the ramp. But I must have just barely missed that 1 wire with my tailhook, like just barely. So here I'm looking at the ball, and it's not super egregious to me. It's something that I would consider like, hey, this is a acceptable pass for someone new who doesn't know all this stuff. But I didn't catch anything. And it was interesting because it was perfectly timed to the exact instant that I was convinced that I had bolted, I guess. I mean, maybe I just need to be a better ball flyer. Like this little tiny fall down at the end, like that was enough for me to bolter. Okay, I guess so. But the exact instant that I was convinced I was going around was when the hook had finally reached the 4 wire and I had grabbed that one. And to top all misery on top of that is the little G-suit. What do people call the thing on the side of your thighs that make it, some people call it the comfort zipper. I don't think that's actually the name for it or not, but it's what you zip up so your G-suit naturally is tight. So when it inflates, it's, actually helping you there. That little loop actually grabbed an AC inverter reset in the T-45. And so when I trapped the 4 wire, mentally I'm like, I'm going around. And then the next second I'm crashing and slowing down to a halt. And my master warning's going off in my face with like a bunch of different screens. I can't remember what else was going off. And the next thing that I remember coming to my senses, which was probably only 3 seconds, but like on an aircraft carrier, 3 seconds sitting in a lane in LA is pretty significant. It's, hey, 100, we got you. You can pull it back now. Look at your director. And he's sitting there, the director is pulling his hand back and kind of throwing his hands up being like, dude, what the hell? Like, we need to get you out of here so the next guy can land. You resisted everything he's saying. He's like, I just need a fucking minute. Like, just let me sit here, gather my thoughts, and then I just need to remember the next thing to do, and then we'll get out of here. And then it takes you like 2-3 more seconds after that. And it's like, okay, yeah, I know what's going on. I'll clean up. We'll go off to the side. Luckily, they had to sideline me for gas, so I got the next 20 minutes to kind of decompress and get myself in the mindset and then roll forward with it.
Was it dropping just that relay back in? Everything's good?
Oh, yeah. That switch, as best I can remember, literally there's an AC1 and AC2 reset. And again, all the new T-45 instructors that'll be with will make fun of me here for not understanding exactly which one's which, but it resets once and trying to like kickstart that inverter back in. And so when the deceleration in the hook pulled it forward, it was now holding that switch in the reset position. And when I finally came to a stop and there's no more deceleration, it popped the switch back up. So to resolve that emergency, nothing had to happen. It was easy, but it's funny that all these things lining up, you're mentally convinced I'm going around, and then it grabs a wire, and it is the most violent deceleration that like you're preparing for it, but it is more intense than what you're expecting. And then on top of that, you have master warnings going off, and then you got the boss yelling at you. So last thing you want is like a target on your back for the next time you're flying around, and that boss is now hawking you and being like, okay, what's this joker going to do next time? Well, before you can trap again, you got to get off the front of the boat in the first place. What was that first cat shot like? Yeah. Not as memorable as the first landing. So I'd like to say that one went, just as expected, and everything was all hunky-dory going off the front. I do remember what was interesting, and we'll skip forward to it with the F-18 side too, is at least to me, in the T-45, the trap was much more violent, and the catapult shot was like, okay, that's cool. And the F-18 is the other way around. I don't know if it's because like the F-18 is just a lot heavier, so it has more inertia, and naturally it just doesn't feel like it's crashing down to a stop. But they changed the weight on the arresting gear, so I don't know to what degree that should match a deceleration rate. This is another nerd question going through there, but the F-18, I remember being more impressed with the catapult shot, and in the T-45, I remember being more impressed with the trap. But this is all like, your first times for everything going through things. So yeah, it was pretty wild. Yeah, the catapult, I don't remember anything super crazy from. I wish I had a better story about, hair on fire, almost running out of the water. Actually, I don't want that, but I remember the trap. I don't remember the launch so much. So,
any good stories from any of your friends there at the boat that time? I'm guessing it wasn't just your one significant emotional experience. Maybe there were other people having a grand day at the same time as well.
Oh yeah, totally. I struggle to think of anybody in particular with any individual stories outside of you just get your generic screaming wave off and power calls that, make your blood curdle. Here we are at 22,000 feet waiting for our turn to come down the chute, and before we get our Charlie comm, and you just hear, you're screaming power, wave off, wave off, wave off. And you look down instinctively to look for a fireball on the deck. But for someone who has never experienced what those calls are from an LSO, in hindsight, they probably were like your more traditional power, wave off than actually, hey, we're worried about you hitting the back of the boat kind of thing. Again, like they're being super conservative with all the different things that they're going to put you with. But that doesn't do any wonders for your psyche. You're doing this for the first time, and you hear 3 or 4 of your friends down below that are just getting waved off and screamed at, and then paddles are coming up, and they're trying to act really calm after it. They're like, hey, 103, this is paddles. I'm like, oh yeah. And then you hear their voice shaking, like, yeah, paddles, what's up? Say, hey man, we waved you off that time because you got too high at the start and you pulled too much power off, just like we tell you guys not to do, and you come crashing down in the middle. We can't have that. This is where they make their money, right? Like they know the things to say to get you calm and put you in the right state of mind, because everybody who's at the boat has proven that they understand enough on how to fly that airplane around the field. So when they show up to the boat, all they got to do is we just got to perform to what they already taught us to do, which I think is again, another pretty awesome quip for the training that the Navy gives you. They're not throwing you out to sea necessarily, and they're not having a sink or swim mindset. Like you're not going to go to the boat if you're not recommended to go to the boat, rightfully so. Just with the weather being bad, and they were trying to make it work earlier on in the Det to try and find like the weather that was okay enough. And that's kind of a key word, is like, is the weather okay enough? And like everything else, there's pressure to get the X's done, the production. We need to get these students qualified so they can move on to the next phases of training. But they might have been pushing it a little bit, because I do remember there were multiple times when, and this is like trying to reach back into memory. What I do remember is we had 3 students that diverted alone, and that was never the intent. The intent was always if a student needed to bingo and go back home, they would wait for an instructor to join up on them, and then the instructor would lead them back. But for whatever reason, whether the weather was bad enough and their instructors having a hard enough time getting the Kaiser and the landing pattern down and getting those ducks squared, ultimately 3 students were ordered by boss, hey, your signal is divert, go back to Buford. And the students had not mentally chair flown what they need to do. We talked about the frequencies and all the different things and going through fast facts. And I don't know if it was Giant Killer or if it was, who's out there? I can't remember the one that's out.
I think it's Giant Killer.
Is it Giant Killer? It's still down that far south?
It's Beaver on the west coast. I think Giant Killer on the
Sea
east
Lord
coast.
is another one too.
Sea Lord's Jacksonville. Yep.
Yeah. So
no, this is a secret, by the way. It's all in the.
Oh yeah.
You can look it all up.
Yeah. So we had talked about these agencies, and you were with them when they went out, but like they always said, hey, you're going to wait for somebody to join up on you, and they're going to bring you back home. But ultimately, things got kind of shit in the handbasket pretty quick, and they sent everybody back to Buford. And the best way to tell the story is that there's only one runway that's in use at Buford. There's one runway that you show up to the initial for, and there's one runway that you break in one direction, and you all should be flying the same pattern. As it turned out, all 3 students found a different initial to get themselves to, 2 of them being the same runway but opposite initials. And it was like a madhouse, the Blue Angels, doing their whole cross in front of everybody right across the show center. And it's funny to talk about it now, but good Lord, just another testament for like you start testing these boundaries. And if weather is not good enough, man, that call should have been made earlier. Now, with the benefit of seeing everything and how it worked out afterwards, of course, every instructor's going to be like, yeah, we're not doing it. And the weather, very well, I don't remember the specifics of that day, so it probably met all the minimums and we're going through with it. But things can happen pretty quickly, and that's just another thing, part of training. Like, you learn how to handle these situations, and we even took good learning points out of that one, which was the students that were diverted, because they were diverted with the urgency of, hey, y'all need to go home now. That pressed upon them that, oh shit, I got to go back and land as soon as possible, and led them down to these paths to be impressionable from ATC and say, hey, do you want this runway? Instead of saying, no, this is the active duty runway, this is what I want to go to. Because they didn't divert with like fumes of fuel. They had 30 minutes of fuel or something along those lines. So when they're going back home, they could have like settled themselves out. And that's we take learning points out of it. It's like, hey, don't let somebody else drive you into an emergency and move forward from there. So for me, after that first trip, I don't remember any other stories very specifically other than the generic things of I was one of the lucky ones that got to shut down on the carrier, spend the night, and then come back the next day. And for Navy folks that like all you want to do is land on a carrier, one of the coolest things was literally just sitting on the Vultures row that's up in the tower where you look across the landing area and watch all your friends land and then just judge the shit out of everybody else that's going by there. Like that was probably one of the more memorable moments of going through CQ altogether, other than like the, flying yourself mindset is sitting out there joking with everybody and going through there. And then you come back to land the next day and high fives all around. I still had to do section engaged maneuvering phase. So CQ was not last for me. So you finish CQ, but I still had one more phase of training to go before I was actually winged, which is a pretty unique mindset. Usually they try and time it. It seemed to be, they tried to time it such as CQ was the last one.
Okay, we already kind of talked about it, that you went on to fly the F-18. Which coasts, which options, where could you have gone, and where did you end up ultimately going?
Yeah, so they obviously ask you what your preferences are, just like everybody else who's familiar with the Navy in some level, and then needs of the Navy comes first. Your preferences come maybe second, and maybe a random pull of the bucket is actually second, and your actual preferences are nowhere to be found, but ultimately you get there. And again, here's another example of not really knowing the right questions to ask to the right people when you're the one that's potentially making a pretty big decision. So the decisions available for any of the students are you can pick the platform you want or the location you want. In most cases, sometimes that is kind of exclusive in what you're going for. So what I'm getting at is for the Navy specifically, the Legacy Hornet was still an option, the Super Hornet was an option, and the Growler was an option. And you could say, hey, I want my aircraft type first as my preference, and the location second. Really only matters if your preference is the Rhino, because the Rhino could either be in Oceana or Lemoore. And that's specifically, like, obviously they also have squadrons in Japan, but when you are basically bidding for your spot, you're bidding for the FRS, and there's only two Rhino FRSs, which is Oceana and Lemoore. And if you want to go Growlers, then you bid Growlers, because that's Whidbey Island. That's the only place that they've got those guys.
I like the term bid. I don't think I've ever heard someone describe it.
Yeah, right.
Like
you can
that.
tell what's on my mind now as like the translation from after the Navy into something else.
Absolutely.
So yeah, you put what your desire is, and then you move off to something else. And at the time, my dad, since his family's down in Virginia Beach, I still had family that was out there, and so I really wanted to go to Virginia Beach. So I actually put down the Legacy Hornet as like my number one, knowing that like if I get picked up for that, they don't have a Legacy Hornet rag anymore in Lemoore, so it is going to be in Virginia Beach. And then I ended up getting selected for Rhinos or the Super Hornet in Virginia Beach. So I was like, okay, I'm happy. That's what I was looking for. I wasn't necessarily dead set on the Legacy Hornet. By this time you're in Kingsville, obviously not all your instructors are F-18 drivers, so you can kind of ask them questions. They're not giving you like you don't want to fly fighters or anything like that. But you did have at this time still a plethora of Legacy Hornets and Super Hornets. A lot of people did ask these questions too, and I found it odd, but any of the Legacy Hornet pilots you talk to like absolutely love the airplane, and the Rhino guys would always just talk about how that thing is old and piece of shit, and like you need to get with the times, and the Super Hornet is the way of the future. We'll probably get there later on in the discussion. I totally agree with that mindset now for sure, but man, that Legacy Hornet would be fun to fly for sure. That would be a pretty fun airplane too. Me, my naive mindset is like I just want to be on the East Coast, and that was the way I knew for sure if they picked me up for Legacies, then I'd be guaranteed East Coast. I would have played that definitely differently now, because I think flying the Rhino was a much better mindset for, you learn the one airplane that you'll ultimately stay with, because a lot of the guys that I knew that ended up in my time frame getting the Legacy Hornet did have to sacrifice some of their time to transition back into the Super Hornet later as they started sundowning the squadrons that were flying it. So I got the East Coast, which was awesome. Got to spend time with the family that was out there. The weirder part though is for all the reasons that I really wanted the East Coast, which was to be near family, you stayed busy enough that like I really didn't spend a whole lot of time with family to begin with. And the family I had was my aunt, my uncle, they were out there, and parents would come down there pretty often too. So it was easier. And since I'm from Pittsburgh, it was still at least a drive home. Granted, 7.5, 8 hour drive, but it still is a drive versus if you're in Lemoore, you're not making that drive.
What good memories do you have of the FRS and learning to fly the Super Hornet?
Well, the memory that you repress is SEER, and that was right before the FRS. So you literally check in. I remember going through all the paperwork, and then they say, "Oh, you're going up to Kittery," and this was mid-December or something along those lines. So I was
a February guy.
Oh, yeah.
I share your pain.
Yeah. So you understood. When I was going through, we just met that min temperature where they issued you all the nice, like the good cold weather gear, but it was warm enough. And I'm thinking like, oh, this is awesome. Like they give us all the really warm stuff, but it's not actually that cold yet. Like this gear is good for another 30 degrees colder. And then you recognize that like because it's right near on like the thawing temperature, all that snow that's up in the trees is now thawing, melting, and falling down and going straight down, like just right down your back. and making things cool and miserable. Like we don't have to talk about, actually I don't want to really talk about SEER2, but there is plenty of stories. The best training I ever really want to accomplish again is probably the best way to go through that.
I've told folks, if you have the opportunity, I don't know how many people really in the civilian world, maybe definitely in the military though, if you have the opportunity to do it, I learned so much about myself. It's one thing, and there is probably way too much literature out there that you can find stories, and everyone's book, every biography always has a chapter on SEER for some reason. So you read enough of those, you kind of get a general idea. You have no idea. When you go through the actual training yourself, it's incredible. And like I said, if you somehow find yourself in a position where you can raise your hand and say, I'd like to do that. I have a friend that is in that position right now. Yeah, I think you should absolutely do that. We'll leave it at that. Let's go back to the Super Hornet.
Yeah. So from the RAG itself, man, I want to say that my experience was about as vanilla as you could possibly ask for. I ended up renting a place in Virginia Beach with like the 3 other guys that we graduated Kingsville with. So all the F-18 guys that graduated in Kingsville that ended up going to Virginia Beach, we got a house together. And that was probably the best memory of Virginia Beach, was like learning how to fly the airplane with 3 of the guys that you knew from Kingsville and going through everything else. We got along super well. The house was awesome. Spent a lot of time outside of flying with it too. It was a nice balance between like, hey, we're all about in the same time frame of the classes that we're going through. It was an awesome experience. I'm trying to remember like the first stories of actual flying the airplane.
It was the first airplane with an afterburner too, so you've got a lot more power than you had in a T-45.
Yeah, and that's probably an interesting one to go with too, is you definitely know when the afterburner kicks in. And so the first time, you don't know what that experience is really like, and then it shows up. I'm not going to take this story. One of the other roommates that has it, basically going at afterburner, being completely surprised at how fast the airplane is going. His ass is basically still sitting on the runway as his airplane's climbing through 4,000 feet. Then he comes to, again, one of these kind of stories with the instructor saying, hey man, you wanna take it out afterburner now? Like, and he's already, 15 miles away from the airport and just crushing it at 380, 400 knots at 3,000 feet or something like that. So, and I'm sure the instructor has seen this thing like 13 times in the last 2 weeks, but he's got a pretty good story. And that's pretty similar to ours too. Like I don't have anything near as articulate as that story probably, but every time you're flying it, you're behind because it's just a new airplane. It goes fast enough and takes you a while to really get your bearings and know how to be thinking at the speed of the airplane and ultimately faster than the airplane, which is almost impossible to do as a brand new student there.
I know in the T-45, you drop Blue Death on the range at El Centro. In the F-18, not only are you going to do that, dry passes then, the Mark 76s, but you're actually going to drop a 500-pound bomb. You're going to shoot the gun. Was that a pretty formative experience? Did you enjoy employing the airplane, as a combat system instead of just as an airplane itself?
Yeah, it was cool. I think, honestly, the munition that was more impressive to me, like a gun is a gun. You shoot at the right spot. It kind of scatters the bullets around where you're going to be, and it's impressive because the gun is sitting right in front of you and is super loud and sounds more mechanical than you would have expected it to. I remember thinking about that one, like here you think it's going to sound like a machine gun. I was like, no, it just sounds like there's a bunch of metal that's clanging underneath you, and a couple seconds later you see a bunch of puffs of smoke going up. I mean, it was cool. It was awesome. But when it kind of sank into me that you're in an airplane that is not meant to manual bomb or dive at the ground and drop bombs, was when we got to drop the LGTers, or the laser guided training rounds. So you're flying an airplane with a FLIR, which you've never used for the first time, that advanced tactical forward-looking infrared, which was a piece of 90s analog technology put onto a 2010s airplane that somehow can find aliens super well and is the most advanced form. That's a digression for another time.
Thought we weren't going to talk about the aliens. James.
Yeah, we keep away from the classified stuff. But I just, for a second, I think it's hilarious that there are people that call the AT FLIR the most state-of-the-art sensor that's out there. And as soon as you start crediting down that one, I'll call you a liar, because that
20 years ago it probably was very capable.
It was advanced at one point, but definitely not anymore.
Yeah.
But
one should hope not with all the advances.
Yeah. I guess it's what they have qualified to fly on the F-18 now, and what can survive the aircraft carrier landings, and has done the job well enough. So we stick with it. But it's first time for everything. So here you are as a new student, you're flying with these laser guided training rounds, and you have to use a FLIR to employ them. It is pretty cool to basically stick a laser on a target in Navy Dare, drop the jeter, and have it literally hit that laser within a couple feet. I just remember at that point being like, yeah, this is really what you're meant to do when it comes out to precision bombing, is find something and put a laser on it and have the bomb go straight to it. And to me, that was, I guess, more symbolic of what we would end up doing with an airplane versus just like, oh yeah, we'll dive at the ground and drop these dumb bombs at things, because that's how we used to do it. And there's obviously a lot of training by knowing how to do these things, and the piloting skills are good on it. You understand you could still do those things if you need to, and people don't know you can still drop a JDAM that way too if you really want to. You can drop a JDAM from an actual dive. I mean, people are not going to be doing it for the most part, but you could too.
Well, it was interesting when I got to go out and do the low safe stuff with the FA-106 out at El Centro, and kind of sat in on some of the briefs, and the IPs there were incredible. With those of us were just guests bringing a T6 out to fly their people to do range clearance stuff. But
you're doing them in the in the T6.
T6
you were flying
Alpha.
them?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah. So we got to I got to do 2 DETs. So we went out there. So no, they had T-34s. They were being used for Courtramid. So the priority became, hey, we got a bunch of midshipmen. We need to fly them during the summertime. So instead, we'll bring the T6s in to do a couple months worth of low safe work.
Sure. Yeah.
And sitting in the back of the briefs, it was kind of interesting to hear some of the IPs. They go through a very detailed brief and, hey, we're going to drop Mark 76s today and all the minutia of it. And then at the very end, kind of say, hey, if you're ever doing this over downtown, pick up foreign adversaries, capital city, right? For real, things have gone incredibly bad. You're going to all the other magic, exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, that's going to be priority. And doing this, dumb bombing, Vietnam style, while you can do it, is probably not the most efficient employment of the airplane. So. Sure.
Yeah. And some of the more valuable training that we did was actually, they would send somebody out in, what city was that? Imperial? Was that Imperial that's down in, I can't remember now.
Brawley.
Was
it one of the JTACs on the ground?
Yeah. They're driving through the town and going through there. And then that
super
was
cool.
Yeah. You could tell it was an element of hey, we're, playing pretend war here, but you could make the parallel in your head a lot easier with that kind of stuff from what the Navy, wants you to be ready for when they send you on a deployment. Then, okay, cool. Can you, shack a Connex box from a 30-degree dive and reliably do that over and over again in the manual style bombing?
It's funny, and you're bringing up a memory for me since you mentioned that. I got to do, one of the guys at 106, he is a FAC-A, so forward air controller, airborne, and he's in the back of the T6. We're flying over Brawley, and we had two, I want to say they were two single-seat jets, but it was two guys that were going back to be XOs and COs, right? So very eminently qualified. They just needed to get their repunch at 106 and then go back out. But he's doing a target talk on, and it was incredible. And at one point, they're talking back to him, describing a correlation, basically. As the FAC-A, I'm describing something. They're going to describe it back to me to ensure that we're both seeing the same thing. And I'm butchering the term, but broadly speaking, that's correlation. And I remember saying, man, that flare must be really awesome. He goes, dude, they're eyeballs outside just like we are. And it helped me realize, it's, that fundamental skill set, the at flare makes you really, really good at it and finding aliens. But it also, you have to start somewhere. So you're starting there at the very basic level.
Yeah. And a lot of the things that they're training you, limitations of the AT flare, we can't talk about colors because it's all in monochrome on it. So you can't say, hey, I want to find the red roof building, even if it's the only one around you. You can't use that color. A lot of the training has been to understand how to use the AT FLIR to orient yourself with the guys on the ground and start figuring out geographic features and funneling points and all these cool things to get you ultimately talked on as quickly as possible and as effectively as possible. Because nothing's worse than sitting there at minute 3 trying to figure out which field are we talking about. There's 13 different candidates inside this one field of view in my FLIR. And you could talk about the one baseball field. It's the only thing I can see in here, but I can't say it. So
at the end of your time at 106, I'm guessing single seat, 2-seat squadron, so Echoes and Foxtrots. Are you going to stay at Oceana? Could you have crossed over? Could you have gone to Lemoore? Could you have gone to Japan? Where could you have gone, and where did you end up going?
Well, once again, since it's needs of Navy and your preferences go somewhere in the toilet that's down on the second story, which was always nasty over at 106, you get assigned. And so you could go anywhere. For the F-18 specifically, they would try to keep you at the East Coast because that's the least amount of, as much as people want to say, you don't have to spend as much money to send somebody somewhere else. I will say that they kind of spread the love evenly between the coast on who got to go to Japan. And a lot of times the Japan dudes were the priority students because that carrier was almost always in a deployment. They'll call them patrols, but it was always in an underway mindset. So when they sent a student out to that boat, they have to be ready to land at the boat pretty much immediately. So they called them Pri-As. Was it Pri-1s? Pri-As? Pri-As. That basically were going through the CQ phase at 106 or in the F-18. You had a heads up. You knew to pack your stuff away because as soon as you finished in quals, they were going to send you over to Japan. But to answer your question quickly, yeah, they could send you anywhere. Their priority was to probably keep you where you trained. That being said, when we were going through, there was also kind of a slowdown in training at 122. So they were actually pretty quick to pull trigger. I think my class, we had, let's see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think 5 pilots. And 2 of them ended up going to Lemoore, and 3 of us stay on the East Coast. So they also give you the choice. What's your preference? Do you want to be Echoes or Foxes? So do you want single seat or 2-seat, or do you want the location? And so you could pick Lemoore, or you could pick Virginia Beach, you could pick Japan. And best I could tell, they would only throw that into a gonculator on what was, if all these options were available and everybody had their preferences and it lined up, we give it to you. But I think they already pretty much knew where everybody was going at that point. So
which squadron did you go to?
VFA 211, the Fighting Checkmates out of Oceana.
And for those that aren't familiar, single seat or 2-seat?
The 2-seat squadron.
2-seat, very
so
cool.
When I was in there, it was a 2-seat squadron. They had transitioned in 2020 to Echoes. So now VFA 211 is a single-seat squadron.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah,
What was it like learning to fly with a Wizzo?
No different than going through the training too. So I don't know if anybody else has kind of talked about this one, is in the beginning of training, they can put Wizzos in your back kind of left and right, and you just fly the events and it gets done that way. But for the most part, you are trained to be able to do everything by yourself in the RAG. They want you to be able to obviously fly the airplane because the majority of the squadrons are single-seat squadrons. So most of the pilots need to be ready to show up to a single-seat squadron and be effective, in quotes, kind of right off the bat. But they make the decision prior to starting what they call the fighter phase, so your air-to-air phase. whether you're destined to be a single seat or two seat. They can still change it later, but for the most part, it's kind of locked in on if you're going Echoes or Foxes. They have a pretty good idea on what the boat schedule is going to be like when they get you CQ complete, when you can show up to a squadron, and who's going to be needing people on what kind of timeline. So if you've been assigned a two seat, so a Foxtrot going into that air-to-air phase, then they kind of change in the syllabus when they give you an instructor Wizzo. Now they actually get to be a Wizzo, not just kind of sit there and evaluate the whole time, which when you know nothing about air-to-air, it's kind of an awesome deal where you can kind of lean on some experience. Now, they obviously want you to have a baseline level of understanding what's going on, but you got this guy back there that has already done a whole tour and understands how this stuff works, and he can really be a helpful person at times. And there is a pretty decent rift, if you will. I'm sure if you talk to some F-18 pilots about the difference between being a single seat pilot and being a two seat pilot, and why do they make a two seat version of an airplane if it has a single seat version? So clearly that means that you can fly just fine with one seat. Like, I'm going to be the person that's telling you right out the bat that like it's how the people work together. A two seat cockpit with both people working and mind melding is going to be more efficient than having a single seat airplane fly around. But I know you'll find people that'll argue to the ends of the earth about how those extra 800, 900 pounds of gas will always be better. I'm not going to be one of those guys.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think some people would argue with you on that?
I don't know if it's a pride thing. And it's ultimately like there are super effective people that fly an airplane by themselves. Some people will throw up the argument 1 + 1 does not equal 2. In fact, 1 + 1 can equal like -2. And that's true, right? Like you get into an airplane with somebody and it can go both ways, right? The Wizzo can be super high SA, and then as a pilot up there, you end up screwing a pooch somewhere else, or they, are just agreeing with you and telling you where to go. And then now all of a sudden you put yourself in the wrong spot. And I actually have a story for that one. So remind me here at the end of this, I'll talk to you that one on how me as a pilot completely trashed the SA of a cockpit, and we were worse for having basically both of us in there versus me flying myself. But I think you get some of that mindset, and people like to think that you only have the very best Wizzos are the ones that are going to basically make that airplane more effective. And the answer to that one I have is it's kind of half on you as a pilot too for not understanding how to bridge those gaps between the second person that's in that airplane and helping you out. I'm not going to deny that there are some people out there too, and some flights that you have that just trash the SA and you'd rather be doing this stuff yourself. But the airplane itself is still meant to do okay things with two people. In fact, there are stories of like, if you fully trust the other guy that's flying, you can be stuck dealing with, for example, if you're in country and you're trying to work gas problems out, or you're trying to talk air reroutes, or there's bad weather and I'm going to go talk to Dark Star or the airborne C2 node and have my Wizzo still work a air to ground talk on for a target. Things that I could not do by myself, but I can totally task divide inside the cockpit and have him completely go down to a heads down into the screen with the AT FLIR and work these things.
But what a great attitude to have that you're taking ownership for that, right? You could very easily say, yeah, I only want to fly with great Wizzos and the other ones can, go fly with somebody else. What a great attitude to say, you know what? No, I'm part of that process that makes them great. And they're part of the process that makes me great as well. Again, I'm appreciative to know that there's folks out there with that mindset, because it's super easy to make someone else the problem. In fact, it's incredibly easy to make someone else the problem. But
yeah, it makes you look better, right? And it's a terrible human trait, I think, to basically try to make yourself look better by bringing down somebody else. I don't know if people do it consciously. A lot of people will just kind of have this mindset kind of in jest too, just being like, oh yeah, well, I'm a single seat pilot, I can do this stuff by myself. And like what you don't see is all the different things that they screwed up in their entire career that they're not going to own up to, and there's no reason. And when you're in a plane by yourself that doesn't record everything all the time, like you can get away with a lot of these things and you look better on paper. But I can guarantee you that everybody who's gone through the F-18 has screwed something up, and some people screwed up some really big things that just like in the right circumstances didn't get them in trouble. Probably the story that I like to tell in terms of like things can go south fairly quickly. I mean, in the grand scheme, it's probably maybe not that big of a deal, but to kind of set the stage, this was a night flight. I was a senior junior officer in the squadron at the time, kind of like my last year that I was in the squadron, and I was flying with another Wizzo who was about mid-time. He knew enough about what was going on and what needed to be happening, and obviously me up front too, the same way. We're flying a tanker, and we were one of the recovery tankers, meaning that like our main goal on that flight was to be airborne gas for anybody that absolutely needed it.
And I want to throw a little editorial out there. Sure. Usually you're going to put the better folks, right, better sticks, better ball flyers on that job, because you're going to be the last aboard or one of the last people aboard. There's no gas potentially airborne for you. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, it's a fair statement. I would say in today, more aptly, it's just because it just takes you longer to get that qual to become a tanker pilot, just because it's like you have to do all your tactics and everything first. You get all your warfare qualifications, and then, okay, we're not going to spend all this time making you a tanker pilot and not make you a tactician, which is what we really are, what we need out of you. And now with PLM being a thing, the precision landing modes around the boat, I don't know what the state of the world is right now in T-45s and when they're going to, I know that they talked about not going to the boat anymore in the T-45 because now you're using PLM exclusively in the F-18 community to land at the boat. That takes a lot of the hard ball flying mindset out of it. So I think you would find that less of a reason now is like we want the super most reliable guys. However, you can still probably make that statement that I want the guy that has better SA, has seen these problems developing before, and can kind of nip them in the bud before they even show up.
Well, and you as a tanker, I mean, you can literally pull up in front of a chick that needs gas. Like you said, if you have that SA, if you have that skill set by being a senior person, there's only good things can come out of that.
Exactly. And you want somebody who can anticipate those problems, because I mean, hell, if the guy was going on cruise the first time, you make him tanker pilot within the first month, like he's going to not know what's normal and what's not and what's expected of him. But traditionally, yeah, like they wanted tanker pilots who were reliable to land on the boat because you're the last one. There's nobody else that's going to be giving you gas except for the guy that's turning on deck as the turning tanker last recovery. They call it the titler. I don't know if you ever actually heard of that term before.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, turning tanker last recovery. His job was to always keep the engines on, and he'd be the second to last recovery. And so he would land first on that one and then pull off on the side, fold his wings, fill up the ARS, the aerial refueling store, on gas, and just sit there for the entire duration of the last event. He's basically the insurance for the last tanker that's airborne, because like in case that tanker needs gas, then they turn the titler on and launch him real quick because he's ready to go and he's right by a catapult. He's set, ready to launch.
I'm smiling because I'm thinking of our new generation of students, the warrants that have come through 10, and they're going to be the ones flying the MQ-25, the Stingray.
Yeah,
I'm just wondering, will there be a Stingray titler? Well, who the heck knows? It's a different world, it's something in the future. But yeah, sorry, another interruption. I apologize.
Yeah, no, it's very easy to fall down these. I forget you have all these different stories until something starts triggering you. But so this day, we are one of the two. Whenever at night you have two required tankers that have to hold what we call a stone. And a stone is like a required amount of gas that you have to hold for the recovery. So if someone needs gas, you have a guaranteed amount of gas to give them. And we could talk philosophies on how you build airplanes around the boat for literal days. But there's a difference between day tankers and night tankers in the tanking requirements. So in the day, you only need one tanker and he has to reserve at least 3,000 pounds of gas. These numbers probably will vary based upon like what air wings and how conservative they want to be. But for just a general term, the one numbers I remember that we used was one tanker during the day had to have 3,000 pounds of gas, and he could not give that gas to anybody else except somebody who is having trouble landing or directed by the air boss to give somebody gas. So you're the airborne insurance gas policy in case something goes wrong. At night, that requirement changes. There needs to be two separate tankers, and then they each have to have 2,500 pounds of gas. So a little bit more, like since you don't fly the case one pattern super tight around the boat, you fly this giant Marshall stack and a long instrument approach to the boat. It takes more gas that's the thought behind why there's more gas airborne, obviously, at night. And it's just traditionally harder to land at night. I'll make the argument that with PLM, kind of has changed the mindset, and it's harder to find these days of night in a barrel, people would call it, where you're having a trouble landing. And
that's a good thing.
Yeah, very good thing. Yeah, it keeps people safe. All these different things that are along those lines. I'm definitely one of the mindsets that's for it. It's probably the more millennial mindset in me that like, I'm glad I got to go through the manual ball flying process. Glad you got to prove your worth. But I had my fair share of passes that like didn't need to be bad, didn't need to scare paddles, but better man for it? Sure, I'll say yes. We also have lost airplanes, and well, I'll caveat that too with, maybe we'll get to the F-35 crash that happened around the boat. Like that guy was supposedly also in PLM. Now just modal confusion, but it still was a mindset where he could have been there. But get back to the story. So we are one of the two tankers that's required to be around that boat. And we are orbiting around the ship. An aircraft carrier, when it is actively recovering or launching aircraft, is restricted in its ability to maneuver. So it is on a course, it's on its speed. This wind's going down the deck and with the right limitations that we talked about earlier and what the speed is and the direction. So the carrier does not want to be stuck. It likes to be able to move where it wants to go. So they want to make this thing super efficient where we just launch airplanes and we recover everybody in one shot and then free the aircraft carrier to move where it wants to go, and it can turn and do its own thing. What normally happens when the boat doesn't need to go anywhere is it generally picks a box in the ocean on where it's going to continually set its BRC, or basic recovery course, or at night they call it final bearing, of where they're basically driving that boat up and down that they can plan for the things to come by. So after they finish the launch and the recovery of this one event, they're going to turn that boat around. They're going to drive all the way back to where they started from. And then just prior to the next recovery, or the next launch actually, they're going to turn that boat around, and it's going to be back at like the initial spot where it was the 2 hours ago, the hour and a half ago when it was on that last event. The point of this is there's a period in time where that boat is going the opposite direction of when they intend on actually recovering aircraft. And on this particular day, for whatever reason, that boat was longer. It took longer for that boat to turn around and start traveling, let's say north. Let's say recovering 360. The boat waited a little bit longer to turn north than what it normally did. And I was half paying attention. It's late at night. You throw fatigue on these other things, or I didn't really pay attention to like what was going on. And the Wizzo's guy, obviously he's talking on the radios to Marshall. He's telling him what the final bearing is going to be. And there's a rule when the boat is starting to launch aircraft that nobody is allowed to be more forward than the bow, which makes sense because they're going to launch airplanes off and they're going to start climbing. So if anybody's forward of the bow, there's a collision hazard there. So what you do is you basically drop a line right at the tack end of the ship, and you just turn prior to that tack end. You go back behind it and you turn around and you make these loops. And then if they ever need gas, then they're going to reach out to you with 203 Hawk, this guy 305. Right now he's at 10 miles. So my habit pattern was always just kind of wait for the recovery to start. Then I latch the boat on link 16 and I see the course and speed of the boat, and then I draw my line and I'm just doing my little circles there. And you talk about Swiss cheese all you want. Really, it comes down to like, there's a major situational bomb in my head. I could have remembered the heading that we were flying when I launched off the boat. I could have listened to the comms from Marshall when they were going through there. Instead, I'm just sitting there heads down doing probably a crossword or talking something else and just trying to like relax a little bit, watching the sunset down on goggles or something kind of fun, but not paying attention to like the most important things of what's going to go on. And you can kind of see where this is going is I looked at the course and speed of the ship and it's like, oh, it's going 180, and I spun in the direction 180 to the ship. And so I kept my distance away from the bow, which only kept me in front of the bow. And I'm doing my orbit quite literally about 5 to 10 miles in front of that ship, which is right where aircraft are launching off and blasting off into. Now, the glorious thing about a fighter aircraft is you have a radar in front of you. So like that radar can kind of make you feel a little bit safe, or at least give you like a warm fuzzy, hey, in front of me, here's where people are at. And I remember seeing targets start popping up. I remember thinking like, what are these idiots doing? Like they're literally blasting through Marshall stack, because like where I thought I was on the carrier was like near to the Marshall stack, but up my altitude that I'm allowed to be at or something along those lines. And you see these guys flying through there. And it's like, they're not supposed to be climbing through here within 10 miles of the ship. Like 10 miles, that's my airspace. Like this is where the tankers are supposed to be. And the first one goes through and I like got angry. And the second one comes through is like, what the hell is going on? And then I interrogate the transponder of the aircraft that came through there. And the second one was a Growler. And there's always a quip about Growlers being in there being like, oh yeah, Growlers doing dumb Growler things.
Greatest air-to-air threat to the Marshall stack is the Growler.
Yeah, basically. And then I remember thinking like, man, these clowns have no idea what's going on. And then when the third one launched and came away, is like, that's when like the part of my brain's like, what's happening? It took a little bit more of like looking down to the ship and recognize that, oh, the course is now 360. I immediately know what's going on and I'm the asshole. So skedaddle, go over to the other side, and then act like nothing happens. The funny thing is, like, Marshall's not reaching out to me. They're not saying that, hey, dude, what are you doing over there? They assume that, like, you're higher SA and there's a reason that you're over there because you're a tanker pilot and they expect you to have higher SA. My Wizzle even made a comment being like, hey, are we supposed to be up here? And, like, but that's where he left it. And I was like, yeah, of course we're supposed to be here. What do you mean like, I don't understand what you're trying to get at. Had there been a little more assertion there, like, that might have been triggered the mindset of, like, oh, shit, dude, I'm putting us in a bad spot. So he had recognized it, and afterwards, he's like, yeah, I thought, like, we were waiting to give somebody gas or something. Like, I thought you were coordinating on the radio. I don't fault him for it at all. Like, there are all these different signs I could have gotten, and I didn't. And I felt like an idiot for it. And it's some of those stories that like humble you, where it doesn't matter how many hours you have in an airplane. You probably should never be in the mindset like where I'm right first. And you should always be looking for these mindsets of like, why are things not what I expect them to be? Don't immediately go to like, oh, that's probably somebody else's problem on what's going on.
When in doubt, everything in life is my fault always. And it's a little bit dramatic of a way to say it, right?
Sure,
but
yeah.
Maybe extreme ownership is a politer way to say it. But yeah, when in doubt, what am I screwing up? And maybe I'm not screwing anything up. Maybe everyone else is launching the wrong direction. But
that certainly would be a weird day if that was the case. Or I missed some other comm. But I remember coming out from that flight, recognizing that, like, man, that was a nice gut check on... You're definitely nowhere near as experienced as you think you are. And I don't know if anybody else actually dodged me or saw me, or even like maybe they didn't even see me. We just kind of got lucky that big sky, little airplanes, even though there's a lot of airplanes in 10-mile ring around that aircraft carrier. And there are procedures to keep you safe, but like if you're not following those procedures, certainly didn't seem like there was a lot of safeguards to make sure I continue to stay safe up there.
You mentioned this was kind of, you were a little bit more senior in the airplane, right? Was this second deployment?
Yeah.
What about that first deployment? How far into the squadron were you timeline-wise?
So I joined VFA 211 in essentially December of 2016. And our first deployment was April 2018. So I basically showed up to the squadron when they were in what they call maintenance phase, or between deployments, and they haven't really started working up for the next one, which was an awesome time to show up as a new person, because people talk about, oh, it's a lot of work. But if you want to actually like feel like you're useful to a squadron when you go on a deployment, then meeting all of the workups is definitely one of the ways to accomplish that. Not that you have any say in what's going on. In today's world, I would argue that with the number of pilots that they need in a deployment status, you're probably less likely to find guys that have an entire 2 years at a squadron before they deploy. Most of them are just going to be like, we just need guys as soon as we start having the next squadron getting ready to deploy because we need to get their numbers healthy. I will not claim to be the person that's super smart on the manning at PERS. You just echo what other people are talking about, which is there is a crisis, and crisis, I use that word probably a little loosely. There is issues that need to be addressed in manning, and especially with fighter aviation, and they do some creative things to make sure everybody's boxes are green before deployments. I know a lot of my friends are getting pulled early from shore tours to go back to sea under that mindset is we just need people to deploy.
Makes sense. Well, the reason I asked the question, so you had a little bit of time to kind of get spooled up. I don't think I've ever had anyone talk through Air Wing Fallon. Did you guys, I'm guessing you were part of the squadron when you went out to Fallon?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Is that Air Wing Fallon, there's Comp 2X. Is it the same thing? Is it different things? What's that process? And then obviously we'll talk about that first deployment.
Oh, yeah. They're totally different. So if you don't mind, I'll walk you through like kind of an entire workup, or at least what happened to us. They might have changed some of the stuff now. Some of the first things that they'll do, they kind of start from a unit level first before they start bringing in the entire Air Wing. And then after, think of this collectively, like we start small. We start with with your unit, your one squadron, in fact, just your pilots. Then we start building it out to just the squadrons, just the flying squadrons that are in there. And then we bring in the whole air wing. So not just Oceana's air wing, but like, because we had a couple squadrons that were in Whidbey and also a squadron that was in Lemoore. Then we bring them out together as a whole air wing and we do training. And then we bring them out and we put us all on a ship and we do it as like an entire strike group. So what they first start is just a smaller level where they focus on all the individual pilots, individual qualifications. And we start to have a higher priority. Like we're no longer a maintenance phase. We're getting more flight hours and they're allowing us to fly more as individuals so we can build up our warfare quals and get to the point where we're ready to go and deploy at least at a decent level. And if I take a step back, it was kind of funny from mindset of showing up to the F-18 thinking that like 106 was going to tell you how you fight when you get to the fleet, like you're ready, your sword's sharp, you're ready to go. It is an exposure to everything. Literally is an exposure to all the different types of warfare that you're going to have to be expected to perform in an F-18. And then when you show up to your fleet, so for me, VFA 211 and their training officers are the ones that are kind of taking ownership of you and your qualifications and helping you build all your tactics and techniques and get you all your qualifications. So that builds before Air Wing Fallon essentially is we are going to really start focusing on unit level training, or ULT, you'll hear a lot of people call it, to try and get the qualifications done. Because like there are certain congressional requirements, and luckily as a junior officer, you're not privy to these things, you don't care about them, but certain boxes that need to be checked before your air wing is considered good. And that trickles down obviously to the squadrons themselves. And so they have a certain number of pilots that are to a level 3, a level 4 qualification, all these different section leads, division leads. So after we kind of focused on ULT for a while, keep in mind ULT continues the entire time that you do all these other training evolutions, but we just now start taking advantages of bringing people together and starting to exercise the whole machine. So you're always doing ULT whenever you can find time to do ULT and advance your own individual tactics. But at some point, you start changing the prioritization needle towards we're starting to integrate more with either the whole air wing or now with the strike group. And now there's strike group or air wing directives that we're going for, or accomplishments and check marks, not necessarily individual air crews. But wherever you can find time to get some of these events done, you can kind of multitask these things too. So your initial question is like, what's air wing and COM2X like? There's also a thing called TISTA. And I wish I understood I remembered what the acronym was. It's like TSTA or something like that. Think of it as the first time that the air wing will show up on the boat. And it's not to do anything warfare related. It's just to get in the rhythm of what the boat life is like. And actually, even before TISTA is what they call deck cert. Deck cert is like getting the ship, in our case, the USS Harry S. Truman, certified to basically launch and recover aircraft again on like its own without extra help outside the Navy. So you do deck cert's like a week long, but the next thing would be TISTA. And TISTA is like, okay, we're bringing the whole air wing in here now, and we're going to do cyclic ops the way that we expect to do them. Where deck cert's literally just, hey, let's get the qualifications of showing up to the aircraft carrier, getting all the people involved with launching and recovering aircraft, get their quals, their min quals, so that the Navy signs off being like, yep, Harry S. Truman, you can recover and launch aircraft safely. Then you bring in TISTA, and TISTA is, okay, let's bring the whole air wing and let's try to fly cyclic events like we would normally do. So no longer is it just CQ, or we're just coming there with like onesie twosies, F-18s, and getting our traps and our cats, and the E2 comes in and gets their traps and their cats and they get out of there. Now it's, okay, let's bring the whole air wing. Let's get everybody practice with moving everybody around the deck. Let's do a cyclic launch. So everybody's launching, and while the event 1's airborne, event 2's walking on their airplanes, and they're getting ready to go. And then right at the time for event 2 launch, they launch all the airplanes, recover the first. That's cyclic stuff. So that's TISTA. And keep in mind, all these events have months in between them too. So it's not like this is the 2 months leading up to deployment. It's going to be deck cert, TISTA, Air Wing Fallon, COM2X, go. It's, I would say, man, I wish I remember when we got off of like, your ULT is really hitting hard now. We're going to start getting ready for deployment. So Air Wing Fallon is probably the first time, and the reason that I'm sure that people talk about Air Wing Fallon and COM2X, because those are the two big ticket items before deployment from an aviator standpoint and from the strike group standpoint as well. Air Wing Fallon is where all of the air wing shows up, to include the helicopters too, in Fallon, Nevada. And they have an entire syllabus that takes, man, I think it's maybe 4 weeks. It's split up into 3 phases. They get progressively more complex to the point where you build up to flying large force exercises, LFEs, on a pretty routine basis. So it gets you, for lack of a better word, I know they're always constantly reviving the syllabus. When we were going through, it has a lot of large strike, Vietnam style mindsets to it. I know that they've revamped the syllabus since then, so it's a little bit different now, and probably for a good reason of moving towards the directions of different the ways that we expect to fight. But really what it does, it gets you comfortable working with the air wing, understanding the communication that's required to effectively communicate and be able to launch a very complex mission in a fairly short amount of time and get used to that level. Like up to that point, I mean, you're only flying with at most 4 airplanes in your division. and then going up against however many bad guys we put up in the sky for unit level training. In Air Wing Fallon, like the good guy side can be, the blue air side can be up to, 20 plus planes and different elements going through different things. And so it kind of exposes you to the roles that need to happen, the coordination that needs to be done to keep everything as safe as possible, but while still being combat effective. All that comes in Air Wing Fallon for the first time. And so for a new pilot showing up to a squadron and being able to see all these things happen, it's pretty humbling. You show up into a room with 35 other people and they ask you, hey, are you the screen element today? You're the escort lead, you're the strike lead, or what are you doing today? Or you're the vest element for EA or something like all these different roles that necessarily weren't taught to us going through 106 or even in the unit level training up to that point. A lot of it I would consider like on the job training at that point, where you figure out what you need to do in order to make it safe. Like no longer is it we're doing everything from an individual level execution for mission quals. For me, it's there's an ultimate mission objective for this whole strike that's going out there, and we got to figure out a way to make that stuff work. So Air Wing Fallon is a whole syllabus that's done in Fallon, which also is an awesome time. We'll talk about some of the downtimes of like things that people will do to blow off steam and see a lot of cool things.
Everyone talks about the airspace is really great, and that's usually a code way to say there's not really much else other than the airspace out there.
Yeah, they're probably remiss to say that the training is really good too. I mean, like that whole complex is meant to get people a lot of reps and flying a lot of airplanes, doing a lot of things. The airspace may have been good. I will argue that they need more airspace now, depending on the stuff that we're going after. It gets limiting real quickly. It's hard to make the case to the FAA to grab more airspace in that area because between the Fallon training complex and the Nellis test and training range, and then the airspace I used to be at down at Edwards and Joshua and 2508, like that whole area of the country, man, there's not a lot of places you can go if you're trying to fly an airliner somewhere. But you ask anybody who's trying to solve tomorrow's problems today, and more airspace is definitely something that is high on that list of things that we wish we could grab. And there's other ways to kind of go about those things, but I would struggle to find somebody who is going to tell you, oh yeah, the airspace, we got just enough. They're hard arguments to make. No one wants to give up more airspace, especially when we already occupy a whole lot of that space out there. So that is Air Wing Fallon.
And then after that's going to be, we're going down the list here. After Air Wing Fallon, next is COM2X.
Yeah, COM2X, which again, acronyms. We used COM2X all the time. And what does it actually? Composite Training Exercise.
Oh, that was impressive.
I'm sure.
We'll call that close enough.
Yeah. Something along those lines. All it necessarily means is this is the first time that we are bringing every element of the strike group together. And we are going to, again, do another kind of tiered training progression where it starts off kind of a slow, well, I don't know if you want to use ship terms. I don't know, a slow steam, a slow wake zone. I don't know. Crawl, walk, run. Right. Same thing with the whole strike group. So the problems are a little bit easier in the beginning, a little mild, and it gets up to the point where you get to like a full-blown war almost. And we do as best we can to simulate all the different scenarios that the strike group could find itself having to face in the upcoming deployment. It's rough. I mean, you talk to anybody who goes through COM2X and there is some downtime, but ultimately you're still on the ship the whole time. So you're not really able to blow off steam anywhere else.
And you can fail too. It's not a guaranteed pass at the air wing, gets certified.
Yeah, correct.
There's some pressure there too.
They do a pretty good job at ratcheting up that pressure to the point where it's fatiguing in a positive way, right? And I say that coming from somebody who now is doing some Part 21 stuff, and like fatiguing is a pretty bad word to be using. But you'll find yourself, and there are minimums, right? You're supposed to say cry uncle when like you are not reaching some of those things, but everybody's manned to like the appropriate level in which that like in order to effectively manage the battle space, you're using everybody in the squadron. Either they have to be resting now because they're the guys that we're going to start using for the early morning alerts that are showing up, or we need this guy because he's the only one with this qual that can go through and fly this kind of mission. There are long days, and so even longer weeks in an extremely long month. And the goal being that like anything that you see in COM2X is above and beyond what we hope you'll ever see on your actual deployment. If all said and done, right, by the time that thing's over, you should be exhausted and you should feel like you have a better understanding for the people that you need to communicate with in the event that something bad is happening, and the skill set and how to at least start down that path. No one's expected to be like a perfect tactician or a perfect rules of engagement follower. I mean, you always follow the rules of engagement, but like you should know the people that are within your realm to talk to make the decisions that you need to make to be successful and everything work to happen. And COM2X gives you that experience to pull from, where you see a variety of different threats that are posing the carrier strike group, and you kind of get debriefed on the things that you can do to go around there. Now, I say that being like the first COM2X that you go on as a new guy, like you just show up to what you're scheduled for yet, and then you follow the advice from others and you do okay. But I am certain that it's even more pressing to the surface warfare tacticians that are the ones making these decisions based upon entire ships and submarines and aircraft carriers and where you want to put these guys and set them up the scenarios. Like we were, at least from the air side, all we cared about was the air picture and setting everything up there with some small things with the surface ships, but that wasn't a really big deal. For us, it was always focused about air. So you got to work that problem with the constraints of now you're on the aircraft carrier and you have the aircraft carrier assets. So it's cool.
Air Wing Fallon, Comp 2X, now the Air Wing's ready to go out. Did you feel ready after all that training? It sounds like a tremendous amount of time, a tremendous amount of kind of formative experience as a young combat aviator, but did you feel ready to go out and do the thing?
Yeah. You don't know what you are necessarily, in our case, we didn't know what we were really going to be doing when we went on deployment. ISIS was still a thing in Syria, so we had an idea that's probably where we're going. They train you well enough, right? I see you use the word well enough that you're ready. Like you go out there, you know what's expected of you, but of course it's still a pretty big responsibility, and it's hard to really put yourself in that mindset of knowing how you're going to perform until you go out there and do it yourself. When it came to the basic skills of flying around the boat, being ready for deployment, seeing all different mission sets, yeah, they set you up well. So it's a good side. But it still is in the back of your head that you've never actually flown into somebody else's country doing what you've been trained to do this entire time. But up to this point, it's a little bit interesting to say that like from 2016 on, and here we are, 2.5 years later, is the 2.5 years of flying the F-18 before they finally get you to the point where, all right, release you into the wild and expect you to do good things kind of mindset.
So what year and where in the wild were you released? Where'd you guys go in the world?
So we knew when we were leaving that our deployment was going to be about 7 months. And we knew it was going to start in the Mediterranean. But what was interesting is leading up to even the first day of cruising out of Norfolk, there were rumors. This is when James Mattis was Secretary of Defense, and he started coming up with this dynamic force employment mindset, which was kind of new at that time. I mean, it was new at that time. That was kind of his MO. And what it meant for us was there were rumors swirling that he wanted to kind of change the mindset. So every deployment kind of before us was they went into the Mediterranean, they went down the Suez Canal, and they worked in the North Arabian Sea, if not going up into the Gulf. So our expectation was we were going to be going down the Suez Canal and at least start in the North Arabian Sea, just like the Air Wing before us. But that wasn't it. We were initially ordered just to go to the Eastern Med and spend time in the Eastern Med. And very quickly after we left, there were also rumors that, you know what, we might actually recall you guys back, bring you to Norfolk for a month-long pause kind of mindset, and then send you out to the North Sea. The mindset was, hey, we want to operate a carrier for the first time in seas that we have not put a carrier for in decades. And that's ultimately what happened. We ended up going to the eastern side of the Mediterranean. We stayed there for 3 months. We came back home. And I say home because the East Coast squadrons called it home, but the West Coast squadrons were kind of curious what they were going to be doing. Were they going to send everybody back to Lemoore and Whidbey and even Jacksonville down where our HSM squadrons were? And the answer was yeah. I mean, they kept a lot of their stuff on the East Coast and a lot of the stuff on the Truman, but they did send their entire people and their whole squadron, all their aircraft went back to the West. So that was unique. I mean, like we didn't really know how to deal with that before. No one was prepared when we went on deployment for this. So it did throw a little bit of an interesting mindset for everybody that was in Virginia Beach. It was kind of got a lot easier of a shift mindset to come back for just a month and leave again. But for everybody on the West that generally close their leases and expect to be gone for 7 months and then they're back, and then not to mention families who they moved in with like potentially their other families because they knew that like their significant other was going to be gone for 7 months. It was more of a deal than I think you initially expect. Like the more you think about, oh cool, you're back for a month. It's like, well, there's all these other things that happen too on this mindset. And it was supposed to be a working port call in quotes. So we still did a lot of flying, and it was very much still like mission oriented flying where you kind of kept those skills sharp. It wasn't like we're dropping the ladder or something and trying not to pay attention to those things. So that's ultimately what happened. We went up to the North Sea, then we spent some time up there as well. It was eye-opening, and here's where it really made our money of that whole PLM stuff we started talking about earlier. The North Sea was having 20-foot, 30-foot seas at times where the boat's really moving and it's doing that whole rolling thing, like the dark and scary nights that people talk about, landing behind the carrier, watching the lights go up and down and wondering how to figure this stuff out. But what I'll tell you is outside, I think there was one time when the weather was bad enough that like it just took us longer to recover airplanes because we were vectoring them longer, or we needed to send somebody up to get gas. I think that was the only time that we gave gas, and it was a testament to PLM, and like it was so stable and so reliable of landing aircraft back on board that we never really had an issue, even with the deck moving more than it ever had any other time in my Navy career. We even got a cool deal where we got to go inside one of the fjords up in Norway. It was basically I wish I remember the dimensions of it. It was like maybe 20 miles long and 10 miles wide, but this super deep water area, so you could put a carrier in there. And it harks back to World War II, and they used to hide carriers inside of these deep waters. And so we got to literally take a U.S. aircraft carrier and just drive it up and down like a 5-mile box and have shipping ferries and passenger ferries and all these different boats that are just like passing the aircraft carrier left and right. It was an interesting dynamic for us for flying because like we had such a condensed airspace compared to what you're normally used to using just over the water where you have everything that you ever want. In Norway, we only had like another smaller area to work with, and you basically pushed right next to the ship, went right to beam it, and had a nice, really quick dogleg to final and land on the ship, and it worked pretty well. One of the surreal experiences was actually getting launched off the front of the ship, and there'd be like a mountain in front of you, and that's like never something you think about with an aircraft carrier is being launched towards terrain. But sure enough, yeah, that was time there. So that was Mediterranean, came back for a month, then went up to the North Sea for the last 3 months, and came back, and we got back just about a week before Christmas or so in 2018. So it was pretty good.
That's an awesome time to get back. What was that like bringing, did you get to fly one of the airplanes back?
Yeah, I flew an airplane back. It is a pretty emotional experience, and it is pretty surreal to watch all 11 airplanes on the deck, the carrier at one time, and get all launched in succession, and then all coming back in one formation. They're long briefs because there's a lot of stuff to talk about in some of that formation flying. But I mean, from my experience, it wasn't as complicated as I kind of expected it to be. It's just everybody kind of knows their role, what they need to do, and you split it into different 4 elements that like you know how to fly with, and it was pretty cool. A lot of family that was there, so the standard kind of homecoming stuff. It was a good deal.
Okay, made it home. First big time out there, really kind of split in 2, but back in the U.S. for a little bit of time. One thing that's kind of maybe outside the Navy, but still aviation related, is I think you always had the passion for general aviation, but you ended up buying an airplane. So I was wondering if maybe you could tell us about the Lancer. Yeah,
my buying experience is, I think, unique in such that there wasn't a whole lot of shopping for a specific type of airplane. There wasn't really a lot of research being done ahead of time, other than just like, hey, these are the extra costs that are associated with it, and cool, airplane ownership's going to be expensive. I know going into it, I'm not trying to make money out of it. I want an airplane because I think that's always something that I've wanted to have. And as luck would have it, there was an E2 pilot in our air wing, and he had gone through training with me all the way from Corpus and into Kingsville. So him and I know each other at least from the beginning of basically API. And he was basically selling a Lancer 360 because he had recently got a Lancer Legacy and was looking to offload that one. I had flown with him a couple times at that point because he learned that I was kind of a GA guy. And I think, I don't know if I met you before I owned the airplane,
or was it right after you bought it?
Right after I bought it. Okay. I'd flown with him a couple times and seen the airplane, actually flown in that 360 a bunch of times. And I was always skeptical first of the experimental market. And by flying with him in experimental airplanes and hearing his philosophy on it, it kind of made me do my own research, if you will, and kind of paying attention that like it's not at all what the initial gut instincts of I think most people when they think of an experimental airplane, what they actually are.
All glass cockpit, just an incredible machine.
Oh yeah,
very fast.
Yeah. So this one, he was teaching me a good bit about the airplane because he actually had it while we were in Kingsville, I think is when he bought it. So I did not fly with him when it was in Kingsville, but then we both ended up in the Norfolk Virginia Beach area. And I flew with him a couple of times out there. And yeah, the airplane, it's awesome. It's basically a G3X touch, got a whole autopilot inside of it as well. It cruises, I'd say easily at 175, 180 knots and burns like 7.5 gallons an hour. You can do the maintenance on yourself. It's a pretty easy airplane. There's not much to it. It's not very complicated. I wish I had that airplane earlier of my time when I was in Virginia Beach, specifically because it would have opened up a lot of that eastern seaboard to go to on a more routine basis. And from being from Pittsburgh, like I think I only count on one hand how many times I've been back to Pittsburgh for the 4 years about that I was in Virginia Beach. And that would have completely changed the game of being able to pop up there for even a lunch and turn around and come back.
I try to tell folks, even with the RV6, so same engine that you have in the Lancer, 30 or 40 knots slower. So a little bit slower airplane, but nothing wrong with that.
Probably cheaper on insurance, so.
Significant.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can compare numbers, but I guarantee you mine's probably a quarter,
I don't want to talk
quarter
about
of what yours is.
Yeah.
All that to say, right, like 12-hour car drive back home to Tennessee, I could fly home in 3.5 hours. There were times where I'd go home for the weekend and wouldn't tell anybody if I'm being honest about it, right? But just pop into Tennessee, hang out with the family, pop back into Norfolk. No one knew I was gone. It makes the world a smaller place.
It certainly does. And there are plenty of other airplanes I think would accomplish about the same thing. I didn't necessarily need as much of the speed, but the airplane kind of fell in my lap with my friend that was in the same air wing and was vouching for it. And he's like, hey, you can have first rights to it if you want. And I ended up debating for a while whether I want to take it, especially knowing we're going to be coming up on deployment. I was going to only be able to have that airplane for about a month before we ended up going on deployment. But as it was, he had a pretty decent collection of people like yourself included that was all around there that could keep the airplane flying even while I wasn't there. So it was an easy decision. It wasn't necessarily that like the airplane's going to sit for the entire time on deployment. Like, no, it's going to fly. But little did I know this is October 2019. So like
world is about to change.
Yeah. And so I had expected coming back after what was supposed to be about a 4 to 5 month deployment. So I was supposed to be back around April time frame of 2020 and have extra time to start figuring out my move out to California, and I was going to enjoy the post deployment leave with the new airplane that I had, and I had this grand plan to go visit the United States and see all my friends from college and after that, and kind of changed, but
it's just been put off. It's not wasn't canceled. It's just going to happen on a later timeline. Okay, well, before we get to that, because I know there's a big story to tell there, let's talk about that second deployment. Where in the world did you all go?
So this one was...
When did you go, I guess is the first way to ask.
That's a good question. So we were supposed to leave in September of 2019. Everything was going on tracking, so we basically were back in December 2018, so it was going to be 9 months off before we started out the next deployment. We all knew that was coming up. They did a little mini air wing Fallon, so we did one of those things too in the middle of coming out there, and a mini COM2X. So we kind of did all that stuff again and go through that pain of making sure all those skills were still sharp. And then the time came up. We did our COM2X. Usually after COM2X, you get what they call POM, so pre and post operational movement leave. So in our case, it was pre-operational movement. We all leave, go to our families. And the timing was such that like we are coming back from leave and getting ready to deploy in the next couple of days. So the guys that were going to be walk-on players were literally moving their stuff onto the ship for the deployment. And then right before like that day shows up where everyone's bringing their sea bags and loading up the opening up the aircraft carrier, we get texts from our leadership saying, hey, don't take anything to the ship. We're not deploying in 2 days. Stand by. And so, of course, everyone's like, oh, on WhatsApp. We're like, does anybody know what's going on? Like trying to go to USNI, try to figure out what the hell is going on with the ship. And ultimately, it was an electrical issue. And it took them a long time to diagnose it, such that it took them about 2 weeks just to do the diagnosis of the problem itself. And during that time, it was just get pushed back 4 days, pushed back 4 days, pushed back 4 days. So you're kind of in this whole deploying time. And they eventually found out that, no, this thing is not so great. And they ended up deploying all the other ships in our air wing with the exception of us. They sent them off. And we ended up still sticking around, I think, for about 2 months. And so we left just prior to Thanksgiving in 2019. So almost 2 month delay from a deployment, which at first sounds like a blessing. You're like, oh, cool, we get all this extra time. It was awesome to have all that extra time for sure. But you are always in this mindset of like, well, when are we going to go? We don't know when we're going to go. And at some point you got to rip the Band-Aid off. And like, it's not like they're not going to cancel the deployment. They've already made that abundantly clear. And there's a cost of us not going. And that cost was the USS Abraham Lincoln was stuck in the North Arabian Sea until our carrier could go underway and replace her. On some level, it's selfish of us to be like, oh, cool, we get our deployment delayed. That is an extension to them. And for literally every single day, we're adding days to their deployment. And what ended up being, I think, a 10-month, maybe a near 11-month deployment for them. So I would definitely rather things gone as scheduled, as what we expected, to include us also not spending much time in the North Arabian Sea, because the goal was to just relieve them, North Arabian Sea, sail around there for a couple of weeks, let Iran know we're still there and we're willing to do something if they're do anything. And then we're going to go back into the Mediterranean. We're just going to go back around and kind of do port call hopping and diplomatic handshaking and all the fun stuff that they talk about. Some of the Iran-backed militia groups were starting to attack some of the American bases that were out there. And there was one somewhat major attack where they used like mortars, like $20,000 mortars. And we were starting to head to the Suez Canal, and we were going to be going out there. And the USS Eisenhower was actually coming out at about this time too. So I kind of back up. We were supposed to leave within a couple weeks of when we went out there, maybe the first month on deployment. We were supposed to get out of the North Arabian Sea, just off the coast of Oman, essentially. We were doing circles around there. We were supposed to leave pretty early on and go to the Mediterranean and kind of start the rest of the deployment out there. With the posturing that Iran was doing at the time, CENTCOM kind of scheduled the boat and said, nope, you guys are going to kind of stay in North Arabian Sea indefinitely until we get you some relief. So the relief was the USS Eisenhower, and it was coming off COM2X, and then they did their POM, and then they started steaming, and they're coming out to replace us. They continually extended us, I think, I forget what the timeline was. Maybe it was 2 months, 3 months of us staying in one spot for a place that we thought we were only going to be there for about a month. And by the time the Eisenhower finally comes down the Suez Canal and is surrounding the BAM, that's when they had this militia group attack the bases in Iraq, the U.S. coalition bases. To show a sign of force, we are going to now put 2 carriers in the North Arabian Sea and take a bunch of pictures with them together and talk about, hey, Randy, do anything, like bad stuff's going to happen to you. So we were literally down in the Red Sea and then turned around and came right back to where we were in the North Arabian Sea and just stayed there for another month or something. This is now the time that the Eisenhower is coming on board, is around the 2020, where now COVID's not just a thing that's over in China. It's now moved into decimating Iran. And then we started to finally see some of the news stories about it getting into Europe. But it still was not like oh shit, everything's gone. We had 2 port calls, air quotes again, in Duqm, Oman, which is a merchant port in like the southern portion of Oman. There's nothing there. I mean, the carrier pulls alongside, I think, with our cruiser. They cordon off an entire block, if you will, of the port with a bunch of Connex boxes or shipping containers. And they brought in a couple local vendors. So you had your falafel guy, you had a grilled chicken guy as best they could replicate it. They had plenty of dirty bars that I think they just watered down alcohol with to sell to sailors because they'd pay any price that was going on there. It was not a fun experience compared to the port calls that we were having from the deployment prior, where we were stopping in Ceuta Bay, Crete. We stopped in Marseille, France. We ended up trying to go to Lisbon, Portugal in the second half, and we also went to London. Well, Portsmouth, and then most people went up to London at that point. So now when we're coming back to Duqm, Oman, it was an entirely different experience altogether. And it wasn't necessarily because of COVID, it just there was nothing around that area. So that was the port call they are supposedly investing in and making it a better place. But it is quite literally just a merchant port. They had 2 hotels that sailors got to throw their names in for lotteries and hopefully get a night in one of the hotels. And so they'd bus you 15 minutes into town to the one of two hotels that are next to each other in the middle of absolutely nowhere. You're not allowed to leave the hotel, and they have one pool. They're selling pool tickets to the strike group, so the pool is filled with like 1,000 people at one time. Overall, just hear stories, join the Navy, see the world. Well, some of the parts of the world you might not really want to see. And I'm sure it's going to get better. People, I guess, have these stories about Dubai before Dubai became a huge place to be. So maybe it's going to turn into that mindset, but it'd be cool to see. For us, it was not really that neat of experience. I think I remember waiting an hour and a half to get a falafel, and that was normal on that aspect of it. So a lot of just sitting in a beer tent on the pier and just playing card games with friends for 4 days before we went back underway again.
Any good memorable flying on that department?
I'll tell you what was memorable about it. The short answer is no. We did do some OFS, so Operations Freedom Sentinel. We sent some lines into Afghanistan. I think that was just to kind of like throw us a bone for being in the North Arabian Sea, letting us go do things. So we did some OFS flying, but no bombs were dropped. Actually, sorry, one bomb, and it was to drop it on the side of a mountain to try and see if we could get people to start talking on our radio. I think it was just, again, another bone being like a JTAC, well, I got nothing for you, but like, I know this mountain can be hit and it's going to be within the rules of engagement, so yeah, go for it, guys. But nothing super crazy on that kind of flying. The part that, I don't know why I'm even mentioning this, but I do remember that part of the world just is polluted enough that you could go find ships by looking at these snail trails through the water. Because there'd be like, I don't know if it was algae, if it was dirt, if it was garbage or something, but like there would be quite literally 45, 50 mile long lines in the water. And you could just track these lines all the way up to container ships, and they'd be like parting this stuff. And that was literally everywhere. A couple of weird stories about the Omanis, like claiming that we're busting their airspace, and because they haven't really had carriers operating out there for a while. So, and I don't know if it was just part of politics back and forth of trying to say something about their own airspace, but there wasn't much at all. The long short of it, we did a lot of ULT stuff, so that was kind of good. Got a lot of people some quals just because we're sitting floating out in the middle of nowhere. But that's where we were, sitting there and floating out in the middle of nowhere.
Were you extended on that second deployment to stay in the squadron?
Yep.
Was that something that leadership came to you and said, hey, because you're a qualified guy, because you're a senior guy, we need to keep you in the squadron longer?
So, no, not necessarily. It was kind of a known thing that, hey, we need to keep you for the deployment. I was like, all right, that's fine. And at this point, I'd already been selected for my orders out to VX9 Detachment Edwards. So I knew I was going to be an F-35 transition guy and moving out to Lemoore at some point before I ended up being at Edwards. And I had a class start date. So they basically said like, hey, this is your class start date. We're just going to extend you to make that date. And like, that was fine. That was going to get me about 2 to 3 months, I think, between coming back home and then having to move everything out to California and start out in Lemoore. Well, that also changed when they just kept doing this, like, hey, we'll extend you by 2 weeks, extend you by 2 weeks out in the North Arabian Sea. Like, it just kept being like, oh, extend 2 weeks, extend 2 weeks, extend 2 weeks. And on top of that, this is also when COVID started to become a thing to the States. And now it's harder and harder to get a carrier that's going to be certified COVID-free into a point where they can deploy it. And you remember, this is the Teddy Roosevelt time too, where they go into Guam for all these issues. And suddenly it's very hard to find a carrier that does not have, at least in some form, affected by COVID. And you got to kind of put yourself back in that mindset of that time where it first became like a word that people started speaking, and any number of weird theories was kind of where the Navy was taking it, and they took a well overly cautious mindset. One of them being that they wanted a COVID-free carrier before they could consider us off the books as they carry at the ready. And this is going to turn into, when they finally did release us from the North Arabian Sea, we went up through the Suez Canal, went out through the Mediterranean, and we had our fly-off date to come back home. And normally, when an aircraft carrier, when a strike group comes off deployment, they're in a status, what do they call it? They call it a sustainment. I can't remember the actual word for it, but like, you are the at-call strike group. So if something happens somewhere in the world, you're on like a 72-hour recall where everybody comes back to the ship and we all deploy together and we go fight whatever crisis is out there. And traditionally, you're on that leash, right? You get that 72-hour leash where you can still be home. You can still go on your POM, your post-operational movement leave. You can still go see everybody you want to see, with the mindset of, if something happens, they're going to recall us and we go back. Well, now, since they couldn't guarantee to have any COVID-free carriers, they made the decision that, I mean, in their mindset, if we let you guys port, we have to assume that you're going to have COVID on your carrier, or somebody is going to get COVID, and now we can't recall you guys in a COVID-free status. So instead, they're like, hey, that fly off that you have in 2 days, cancel that, stand by for further word, but for now, just do a little holding pattern off the east coast of the United States. And this was around either late February, early March of 2020. And then from that period on until when they came back from deployment in June, they were just steaming up and down the eastern seaboard off the coast by a few miles, with a couple cool days of like, oh yeah, we'll steam the carrier close enough to the shore where y'all can get cell phone reception. And that was considered like a good deal. Even at the time, I remember thinking like, this is kind of ridiculous. Just let us go home. And if there's a world event that's important enough that requires us to redeploy, like COVID be damned, like that's not going to be the reason you stop a carrier from going and reacting to some portion of the world.
And there was a tremendous amount of uncertainty, I think, at all levels of leadership.
And that's why no one's willing to, I think, put their name as like the decision behind, I accept this risk and this is my name going on that risk decision. Like the easier answer is always, hey, we'll take the risk averse mindset, which is frustrating. And we look back on it, there's a lot of uncertainty going around. So I don't necessarily fault the thinking at the time. I just wish there might have been a little more common sense going forward in terms of like, let's ask ourselves the real question, the question that is hard to answer from someone you as a 2-star, 3-star leader, but like in my mind shouldn't be that hard of a defensible answer. But everything's 2020 now, looking back on it.
That's true.
So
did they fly you off at some point?
I was lucky enough because I had my start date, which was I think May, and VFA 125 or the RAG for the F-35C. And that was always in the back of the mindset of it was a pretty good ammunition to get me off the ship. That being said, there was still a discussion because me leaving would bring down the readiness level because they weren't bringing anybody back to the ship based upon what was going on. So there was going to be a hit to the readiness level of the ship by me leaving. And it became a conversation between our CAG and I guess the naval leadership of the naval, I can't remember whatever chains of command was going on. It's crazy. Like these things were huge deals in my life and I can barely remember the players other than CAG was trying to go to bat for me. But I remember him saying that it's not in my hands necessarily. It's going to be in the entire leadership of these, like the Fleet Forces East, whether they want to accept a drop in readiness of the crewman. They're not going to probably look at it at a complete individual level, but I can certainly throw a recommendation, and the recommendation is going to be that like he's got somewhere else to be. And what helped me is I think my skipper, he's never admitted this, and I'm sure he would never actually go out to it. I think he did me a favor by reaching out to a detailer and basically asking the detailer to put down in words that if Lieutenant Phelps doesn't get off this carrier in time to make his May 4th start date, we're going to have to rebillet him to some other job because we don't have a spot at an F-35 RAG to start a new student for another 8 months. And we can't accept him to just delay another 8 months. So if he doesn't meet May 4th, we're going to put him in and insert whatever job that does not sound desirable. I think he put that in front of CAG so that CAG could bring up to. And this is speculation on my part. I had awesome leadership between both my front office and then also the CAG of the whole air wing. I know it's not necessarily like the same thing across the board with all the different air wings, but ours is pretty solid. I get a sense that they were going to bat for me the right way and made sure that I got off the ship, even if it meant that somebody else was. But it worked out in my favor because they ended up saying, like, they came to me, hey, can you be off the ship tomorrow? And I kind of a heads up, but it was this, at first it was, oh, this is totally like our decision to make within the ship and you're definitely going. And then it became, actually, we started talking to this stuff and it's not our decision anymore. We don't know if this is going to be something that we can do. And then as they fought between different leadership levels, eventually it's like, hey, Lieutenant Phelps, like, can you leave tomorrow? It's like, well, do I have any other options? And they go, nope. It's like, all right, then I can leave tomorrow. So everything went to Seabag and whenever wasn't there, my roommates were able to effectively remove for me. And there it was. So Liddy got caught it off the aircraft carrier, got picked up by my roommate's girlfriend. She drove me back to the house that we had because my other two roommates were still stuck on the ship. And then, actually, no. One of the roommates was actually same deal. He went to test pilot school, so he was there. We all got to go home. One of the other roommates was still stuck on the ship. And then they drove me back. We quickly packed everything up for me. And then I went across country to go show up in time to Lemoore because they needed us to quarantine for 2 weeks prior to start. And this was already at the end of April. So I actually was going to miss the start date at 125 by like 3 days. But they were willing to say, hey, we can accept 3 days. Like, we can catch you up. That's not that big of a deal. And just another sidebar story is I remember a debate between whether I wanted to drive across country or fly. And I was like, well, I definitely want to drive because like there's coronavirus stuff. And then eventually I just sat down. I was like, well, wait a second. Like, I just need to get over there and start quarantine so I can start working again. And there's probably less people are going to fly. And this was quite literally in April of 2020. And I was one of 4 people on an airplane from Norfolk to DFW. And there was entire like 5-minute stretches of walking around DFW where there was not another passenger flying at all. And then it was a flight from DFW up to Fresno. And then I was in quarantine that night in Fresno. So it quite literally was probably one of the better places to be with like less people anywhere else.
You mentioned the F-35. You're a 2-seat F-18 guy, but now you're going to do a tour flying as a single-seat F-35 guy. How the heck did that even come to pass?
I think it just came down to needs of Navy again, right? Like they had a spot at VX-9 Detachment Edwards. So for those that are familiar with VX-9, the Operational Test Squadron for the Navy, specifically the pointy nose side, they have a detachment from VX-9 Detachment Edwards, and that was basically the operational test for the F-35C. And the reason that's even somewhere else to begin with is by the joint aspect of the airplane is it was down there to be an operational test center for the Air Force, the Marines, the Navy, and not to mention the other foreign partners as well. So that's why we were at Edwards Air Force Base. But for me specifically, like they ask you your list of things that you want to do, and I had actually put down VX-9 proper as the number one because I was interested by talking to a few other people about like the operational test world, but didn't really know too much about it. But I knew I kind of think we wanted to do that one more so than doing FRS instructing. So I kind of stuck with that one. And during my last fit rep debrief, my skipper pulls me into the office and I remember him asking, any interest in flying F-35s? I think any pilot is going to probably say, like, I mean, they'll want to fly more airplane types. Like, yeah, sure. I got no reason to say no. That actually sounds like a pretty decent idea. And that was like all we talked about. Little do I know, I think that was like literally a primer for, had I said no, maybe he would have fed back a detailer and been like, oh yeah, don't write this guy orders there because he doesn't want to fly. Or maybe they still would anyway. It didn't really matter. But that's ultimately what I got. It literally, there was nothing more to it for my circumstance than just like, I put it down on the sheet as VX9 attachment Edwards I'm interested in, and ended up getting it. Really kind of a fate twist, because I know I didn't have any idea of the follow-on doors it would open up or the experiences that I'd go through.
Well, speaking of, what was it like going to 125 and learning the F-35?
So it was unique in that now you're showing up as a Cat Other, not a Cat 1. So you've flown how many different hours in the F-18? At this time, the majority of the instructors there were also former F-18 pilots, so they all are coming from the same background. There were no, for sure, instructors that had only F-35 time. There were a decent amount of instructors, though, that got on the F-35 from the very beginning. So there was a lot of knowledge in the F-35 program at 125. But most of like the peer instructors, so the guys that came off their sea tours and short tours, they all were former F-18 pilots and then went through a quick transition and then were now an instructor in the F-35. From that level, it was a pretty easy mindset because everybody could relate to you pretty quickly. That's also going through in the middle of COVID, the heaviest portions of COVID. So there was a little bit of down aspects of it, of like you weren't traveling, seeing a lot of the cool places around California. But I mean, I was there just to get kind of through the program as quickly as possible so I could then move on to Edwards and then start flying and do my actual day job out there at Edwards.
Before we get to Edwards, let's compare and contrast the airplanes, the Super Hornet, the Foxtrot, the two-seat jet, and then now the F-35C. What's kind of some good data points to separate the two airplanes in terms of performance?
So I would say that they fly roughly the same profiles. Maybe the F-35C can fly a bit higher, pretty more reliably, but like you're not going significantly faster in either airplane. The one thing that surprised me the most coming from the F-18 to the F-35 was the reduction in drag, because we always flew in the F-18 with pylons on, and those 2-degree canted out pylons act like giant speed brakes when you're going pretty quickly, and that was not a thing in the F-35. So one of the first times we came back from the working area, the 2508 over Owens Valley, and then back to Lemoore, I think we come back at like 16,000 feet or 200 or something like that. And then around Visalia, you pull the power back, you start coming down for approaching the initial. And I just remember accelerating up to like 400 knots because the airplane is just so clean. Just by how the airplane's built, it's for low observability. There's not a lot of vents or anything hanging out in there, no like parts that are just hanging out in the wind. So that airplane is extremely slick and is very, very, very hard to slow down as you're descending. Versus the F-18, you could just pull power to idle, pitch over a little bit, and like those canted pylons they're gonna be there to help you out. So with that, we also I think had a bigger wing in the F-35. So a lot of times it takes us a little bit of time to get up to like 40K or so in the 40s, but like when you're up there, you can chill up there. And the motor just does a better job, I think, when you're up higher. We sip gas. Even though we carried about the equivalent amount of fuel in the F-35, we started up with, on a good day, like 19,400 pounds, 19,500 pounds. And then in the F-18, the F model was a good day like 16.5. So about 3,000 pounds more. But what I try to tell people is that 3,000 pounds, I think, goes a lot farther to the F-35 than just like 3,000 pounds of gas. So if we're burning about 100 pounds a minute, which is kind of what that was, like you're getting a little bit more than your 30 minutes if you're up high and actually slowing down and things along those lines. So
something I think that's not necessarily appreciated is just how much gas the C model specifically has of the F-35 as compared to even the A, definitely the B, but even, like you said, the F-18.
And it's all internal, right? So like in the F-18, like you have to put that in an external centerline tank. There's, some fuel in there too, but the F-35, man, it's I don't know where they put it. It's literally everywhere inside that airplane, but it does a good job. And for a fighter in today, I think some of that loiter time and that extra gas when you're airborne is extremely beneficial, more so than just like, can it go super, super, super fast and for a couple seconds?
Was it a big transition becoming, as you mentioned, an LO guy, someone that's now flying a stealth jet as compared to the Rhino? That I've seen some that look like someone took the probe and just beat it. Well, I guess it's not a probe and drogue, but the basket and just scratched every little bit of the airplane with it. You wrote their name on the outside with it. A little bit different mentality, I'm guessing, flying that airplane.
So yeah, slightly. They were also just newer planes to begin with, so they just naturally looked a lot cleaner. But LO is a pretty important part of that maintenance. In fact, there are entire shops in the Navy, and they're even like talking about creating a specific LO rate. So no longer are they going to pull sailors from various shops, mainly the airframe shop, and throwing them into like a LO shop, because they still have like corrosion shops in the F-18, but now there's an LO shop for the F-35. I think they're trying to make an actual specific LO rate because you really want to retain any of the sailors that we train on how to maintain that coding. You want to hold that knowledge, because right now they're just generic airframers. I say generic like I don't mean that derogatory at all. Like they're not just these guys. Like obviously they're dual-headed, but the Navy looks at them as they're just airframers. So there's a helicopter squadron over here that needs these guys, and they will send our sailors that have all of our quals for LO maintenance and CDI or collateral duty inspectors. So all the guys that can sign off on LO maintenance, and they'll ship them off to somewhere where they never talk about LO again. And that is a disservice to what we really need. And this airplane needs to be maintained to a certain level to be able to validate all the assumptions that we fight tactics to. And that was kind of, I think, another question you talk about the difference between F-18 and F-35 is how you fight the airplane. Is clearly you've got this cool tool, which is low observability. How does that change the game of fighting the airplane? And the answer is quite a lot, right? And from someone who's flown an F-18 and used the doctrine behind flying an F-18 versus the doctrine of flying an F-35, it takes a little bit of a different mindset to kind of trigger one way or the other. And I'd be lying to you if I told you I didn't like the way the F-35 flying was better. But I think it's more survivable airplane flying around for a while. Obviously, I think is a pretty cool place to be in.
We're still talking about differences. Single seat, single engine in the F-35. All your time out at the boat was in a 2-seat, but also 2-engine jet. So I'm trying to compare. Let's see, it's GE's in the F-18. It's that Pratt motor in the F-35C. A lot of hay has been made. A lot of drama has been behind. Single engine jet out at the boat. I mean, the T-45 you took out to the boat was a single engine airplane as well.
Yeah, and what do we have before too? Like, it's
indeed,
not the first time.
Just kind of curious to your thoughts on the comparison of having done both.
I think it's a very easy initial gut to be like, I want 2 motors around the boat. I never shut off a motor in F-18 around the boat. I'm sure there are people that have. And I'm sure people will eat the words the first time that we lose an F-35 because they have some kind of engine trouble around the boat. But they have designed a pretty solid one. They've had issues with it, but like for the most part, it's been a pretty solid engine, and I haven't really had any reasons to doubt how it's flying around. And ultimately, if having the plane or not having the plane was a difference between single motor and 2 motors, like take the airplane because it's being developed and it's something that the Navy can use right now. And because it has a single motor, like we've got time to figure these things out, and it would change the mindset of a pilot. Like if I have 2 motors, I'm probably more inclined to shut one down for even just oil issues that maybe just a sensor. But a single engine, like you're not going to shut that thing down. You're just going to let it burn until you can't do anything more with it. But time will tell, right? We've had single engine airplanes around the boat before. We'll have them for a while now. I don't see it as like the stake that people try to like pin it to the ground with, being like, oh, that's definitely the reason. Like you'd be an idiot to not want an LO fighter as part of your arsenal on an aircraft carrier, and to just say, oh, because the motor, we can't take it, is, I think, a little cockamamie.
Were you a JHMX guy in the F-18?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Almost all. I think everybody. I don't think there's anybody anymore that probably does not fly the JHMX. Fun fact, I think they actually focus more on training JHMX in the RAG now. It used to be just a fleet thing they do. I think they actually train the RAG. But so yeah, I'm sure you're going with the helmet versus the JHMX.
Yeah, and the reason I mentioned that, yeah, exactly. I know very little about it other than I believe the HUD is basically displayed on the inside of the... Again, let me not make my assumptions known.
No, I'm going to let you talk your way into a hole. We'll see how we get out.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, what's the Commander Fravor quote from the movie? It's like a Ferrari on your head. It's an expensive piece of kit. It's a $500,000 helmet in the F-35. Hoping maybe you could compare and contrast the two.
I'll say of the couple air shows that we've taken the airplane to and hung out, probably by large, the biggest question we have is like, how cool is that helmet? And the answer is it's cool. Like... There are a couple extra things that we can do with this helmet that we couldn't do with the F-18. One of them being the DAS cameras, the distributed aperture system. Man, I can't remember acronyms now. But the 6 cameras that are around the aircraft, they can stitch them together, and you can really turn the camera on and look around and see it. I'll tell you what, from a pilot flying at night around mountainous terrain, that's a godsend. I can turn the ground on, as we say. Like, it's kind of cool from a let me live kind of mindset. But there are other reasons for DAS to begin with. The helmet itself, I think, is just a byproduct of like, by not putting a HUD in the airplane, you need something that replaces like that HUD information. And that's what the helmet is primarily designed to do, is to basically always give you that HUD where it works out well. There are some drawbacks. The things you probably won't hear a lot of F-35 pilots talk about is there's ground jitter. So as you're taxiing around, and this might be an F-35C specific problem, but as you're taxiing the plane around on deck, the helmet bounces around, and like the helmet has to, or your body moves up and down. And so the helmet has to recognize that movement and then stabilize the actual projection inside. And it can't do it that quick. So it kind of is a little disorienting on the ground when like looking through the helmet as it's bouncing around. It's just small things. These are small complaints on it. Like when you're airborne, it works just fine, and it's not something that's going to be super annoying. But on the ground, it bounces around. So that's something that you don't really expect on it. What is nice, though, is the helmet made out of carbon fiber. They take a 3D scan of your head to build you like the mold that goes inside of it. In my mind, it was a lighter helmet than the JHMX was, and I thought it was balanced a lot better. And not to mention, they put active noise canceling headphones in it, so like it actually has some better capability of allowing that noise outside the cockpit to go down. So there are some instances of it like tending to not work correctly, but all in large, the helmet was pretty good. I was always worried. I say always worried. I was concerned for a while when I started flying the airplane that like the helmets are required flight equipment now. In the F-18, if the JHMX didn't work or the plugs didn't line up, we could still fly. It's fine. But that's not the case with the F-35. So...
And there's no spare $500,000 helmet sitting on the shelf with your name on it?
No, there is not. But I'll say of all the years I've flown, the helmet has always worked when I plugged it in. I'm sure people have stories of it not working, but for a data point, when I started flying it in April 2020, my last flight was September 2023, and I can't think of a single time where like, there was one time I didn't fully click it in and it actually popped off on high speed. So literally taking off, like the worst time we had like the changeover between high speed, low speed. But that was the only time. That was because I literally just didn't click it down appropriately. So
what was it like recovering from that?
Oh, it was fine. I like to think that flying some GA stuff makes me very comfortable without flying with the HUD. So it literally is just like, oh crap, there's 100 knots and I don't have a helmet anymore. Well, I'll go flying. It was a VFR day anyway. So like, it wasn't a hard decision whatsoever. So you just fly. And then I looked around and recognized that thing, like you have a collar around the actual connection and it like snaps down and that's what gets it into the seat. And I recognized when I grabbed it with my hand that, oh, I never snapped down the collar. So big dumb idiot up in front. He's the reason that it's not actually flying the way it should.
Well, still comparing and contrasting, was it a MEX-scan radar in the Super Hornet that you flew or AESA?
I was AESA.
AESA. Yeah. Okay. So AESA to AESA, it's the same. Is it the same? Is it similar? Is it the same radar? Is it totally different? What's kind of some maybe corners of the envelope, so to speak?
Functionally, yes, they're the same thing. I think Raytheon built the radar in the F-18 and Northrop built the radar for the F-35. And if you want to impress an F-35 community, they don't call it a radar, they call it an MFA, or a multifunctional array. Radar is just a function of the MFA. So this gets into the answer is both companies kind of have used their AESA capabilities slightly different in the functionality and the task loading and what they're allowing that radar to do. But the big thing is underneath the hood, it's doing everything for you as a pilot. Like no longer are the days of like I'm necking down a bar scan or an elevation scan and I'm trying to look at one particular piece of sky. Like you tell the radar what you want to optimize it for and it does everything else for you.
Is it really as magic as everyone says?
I don't know what people say about it. I'd say they're pretty equivalent from a radar standpoint of like performance when I was from F-18 and F-35. I wasn't blown away one way or the other, put it that way.
Okay, interesting. Well, again, you're talking to a guy that flew behind steam gauges, and my radar was 4th flight and an ADS-B puck, so to me it's all magic. But
yeah.
The first time seeing, again, all of 2 F-18 rides, the first time seeing the way the F-18 radar worked on the repeater in the back cockpit, I was like, holy crap. The SA seems to be significantly different than, again, Mark 1 eyeball when you're just looking for traffic.
Yeah. And they both work effectively well. It's just both companies have designed to use different functions underneath the hood, and some of them integrate in different ways with the OFP of the aircraft. So Boeing and how they integrate with Raytheon is kind of different with how Northrop integrates with Lockheed, but really good job done. There's a lot of, by nature of working in OT, we kind of hash through a lot of issues that integration would have a deal with. But overall, they're both decent kits. Like there's nothing that like I think is wildly different between the two of them. If they really wanted to tailor a design one way, they certainly could.
We mentioned air shows. I'm glad you did, because I think some of the greatest questions I've ever been asked about a T6 or a MH-53 have been at an air show. I don't know why. I just seem to attract the really interesting questions. I'm guessing that's also because people have some of these myths, these preconceived notions that, maybe, I don't know, I'll just throw out a company. Boeing wants to sell more F-18s, and they might maybe cast some shade on Lockheed and the F-35 or vice versa. What are some of those good questions you've been asked, maybe misconceptions people have about the airplane and the program?
Oh, man. Well, I find out a lot of people don't know the different variants of the F-35, and they assume that I fly the one that can take off, well, really land vertically, not necessarily take off vertically. Everyone's got their own opinion on it, it seems like, and they come up to you and they tell you what they think your answer should be, and like you're like, nah, that's not really what I think. And you're like, oh yeah, but it's that way, isn't it? And it's like, no, I don't think so. I'm trying to remember a good example from it.
Why do you think that is? Why are people so opinionated about the airplane?
Obviously, by being in the news a lot about the cost overruns and being the most expensive DoD project that they've written down, so it gets a lot of attention that way. And in my personal opinion, it gets attention in like the wrong areas, or the areas that like don't matter. And for example, and I can't even remember the details of this story either, the complaint was something along the lines of the F-35 can't fly above Mach 1.6 for more than 30 seconds. Something along those lines. And everybody is ripping it in the comments by saying that like, this is a shame that we spent this much on a fighter and it can't fly above Mach 1.6 for, it's limited to 30 seconds. And in actuality, I can't tell you a single time that I got anywhere close to that. Maybe Mach 1.15, maybe. And that's downhill for not very long. I can't reliably think of a regime where I need to be flying that. And so the fact that that is what politicians are going to turn around and start like yelling at the program for is just absurd. I will throw shade at Lockheed all the time when there are things that they should be fixing on the aircraft that don't have the priority. And by being in the OPT community for long enough, I've started to recognize that it's not as simple as like, hey, a pilot's telling you something's wrong with your airplane, you should fix it. It's like, well, is there money associated with this fix? Have we got put on contract? Like, is the right priority there? So we're not going off script. Like we all came up with like the ideas of what we're going to do 5 years ago on this airplane, and we can't necessarily just change the game plan now. And I get that there's bureaucratic processes in there, but it's frustrating. When the wrong stuff gets this kind of attention, it gets super frustrating, because there is in no way, shape, or form should we be answering to why the aircraft can't do something that is just absurd as this. And maybe the answer is like, oh, we have to draw the line somewhere and we can't just like start not making things a big deal. It's like, well, let's be more intelligent on the deals that we pick, because if you can draw a lot of negative attention on something that actually needs to be fixed, that could be a good thing and could be the impetus that we need to actually fix different parts of the airplane. That's timeline accelerated. We expect to need these capabilities in the next few years, or we want something that is not working correctly, but like works just fine in other platforms. And like that code should already have been written somewhere. Like, why can't we just share stuff? And I get it. There's a lot of hand tying and a lot of stuff that goes on, but sometimes things get super frustrating. That is one of them that like specifically, I think I read and be like, this is a non-story, and yet it's getting a ridiculous amount of attention that it should not get.
What's something you would tell maybe to an F-18 guy that's transitioning over, something that you, as that F-18 guy before, maybe something that, I don't know, it's really going to be a 3, 5, 10x improvement, or maybe something, hey, watch out for this, that your F-18 time and your little bit of time before that in the T-45 maybe didn't get you ready for?
It's not fundamentally any harder to fly than an F-18. Like, the airplanes are so computerized now that like it doesn't require a whole lot of skills. One of the funny jokes I keep telling people all the time is, and this is after going through some airline training now, where like those rudder pedals are things other than footrests. In the F-35 with the autopilot on, those rudder pedals literally just change your heading bug, and it's used to steer the airplane. So your rudder pedals aren't used for ruddering; they're used for steering on an autopilot. So you can step on a rudder and it does rudder things, but like it's still a computer that thinks about the movement you want, which is I want some kind of yaw, but it's not actually yaw. If you can get all this different mindset, it's commanding a side slip, which means you still might be going in the same direction. In certain flight regimes, they actually function like more traditional rudders. So if you're fighting it in BFM, it gets to a point where the rudders, do rudder things.
And the airplane knows that, I'm guessing. It knows what regime it's being used in, as opposed to a long transit or a ferry flight versus BFM.
Oh, totally. Yeah. All it's doing is it's pulling atmospherics and recognizing what kind of flight regime it's in. So like if I just slam a whole boot of rudder, but I'm going 400 knots, it's not going to give me like all the rudder it can. But if I'm trying to fight down at the min speed of the aircraft and I use rudder, it's going to give me what it can to help give me extra increased turn performance. It's just, the airplane is smart and it's meant to fly and offload the actual flying skills of a pilot, much like the F-18 was. This is why I'm saying I don't really think they're particularly difficult to fly. The information that they provide is different for sure. This is probably what other people are expecting to hear. But the F-35 provides maybe a little bit more information, but it's just a different way to look at it. I'm trying to think of the best way to answer your question here, but you're gonna have to learn a whole different philosophy on information provided to you, because it collects some different things than the F-18 does. But overall, it's still an airplane.
We mentioned developmental test, operational test. So for most of the folks, the guests I've had thus far have been the DT side of things. So they went to test pilot school at Pax River. They stayed at Pax River and did, they're flying there, and their different, their careers progressed from there. OT, operational test, is something entirely different. So I was hoping maybe you kind of unpacked what OT means for the Navy. I already mentioned VX9, that's where you went, but kind of that background.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I probably could put this caveat up in the very beginning of the podcast that like I am not a traditional test pilot. So it's sometimes easy to talk about my job as an operational test pilot, and maybe I should just drop that test word out of it. And the better way to describe my job is a glorified beta tester, right? Because they give us the new software that's going to be dropped in F-35, and we get to play with it, see where the problem spots in it are, see if we can break it bad. And if we find things that are wrong, work with Lockheed and the vendors to try and get stuff fixed if it's something that should be correct. And if it's not, then we have to find, are there workarounds that are acceptable, or do we need to start pulling different kind of priorities or different kinds of money to try and fix the problems that are there? So from a holistic approach, if we want to take both sides, a DT pilot is going to go through a traditional test pilot school. Generally in the Navy, that's Pax River, although they can send guys to Air Force test pilot school in Edwards Air Force Base every once in a while, and the Air Force will send some guys over to Pax River. But they learn more of the program management of an actual program. So the actual things of where do you find the money, the priority, the bureaucracy mindset of it, like that's actually a pretty decent portion of going to test pilot school. Not to mention like the test plan writing of how to effectively test airplanes. Coming from somebody who has not been in that program, I'm sure that there are better ways to talk about it too, but it's traditionally held in like how to effectively evaluate an airplane, how we characterize all the flight characteristics of an airplane and use proper science terms and all these different things that are on there. A operational test pilot can be best described as someone who we take from the actual fleet and we take them from their CTOR and we plop them into this squadron, this operational test squadron, as a short tour. And the thinking is because they just came from a fleet, they know what a fleet operator wants. And so after something has been evaluated by the DT community, the developmental test community, and has passed all the contractual obligations and the agreements that are supposed to be made with the vendor and the new product, they'll pass it over to OT so they can try and test it in an operationally representative mindset. So for an example, a new missile or a new bomb, it goes to DT first, and they're going to probably test its form, its fit, its function, its ejection process from an F-35 as it comes out, and make sure it's not going to impact the aircraft, cause structural damage that way. But when it comes out to like, how are they going to integrate this one with current tactics, or actually take it to a shot, to a kill, to make sure everything's working, that generally is not done at DT. They kind of pass that over to OT, and then we get to integrate it with our current weapon systems and see, A, does it work as intended? And B, is it going to fit inside of the current way that we fight the aircraft? And that is like, in a nutshell, the difference between OT and DT. So DT has very much contractual obligations, and they need to make sure everything's done, and they'll pass it over to OT, and they'll evaluate it too. In today's world, with everybody else kind of going down, it kind of gets jammed together where both communities are kind of doing doing both jobs. I'd say OT might be encroaching a little bit more in DT than the other way around, but like we're both limited in people. So we kind of work together as we can to kind of help each other out, because it's just everything's far behind and it's only getting farther behind. So you try and find ways that you can to kind of speed up the process, where OT will come out and we'll help DT if we can. DT does the same things. They might be looking for certain data points and they'll ask us, hey, if you can fit this in on your flights, please do this, because we just don't have the time, or we don't have the airplanes that are up right now in order to look after these things. So if you say like what the difference is right now, it's a little more blurred, but traditionally, yeah, you've got a difference of like the operational test pilots are taking what's already been vetted by DT, passed off to them, being like, hey, is this going to work? And the cool thing about OT is then we also work pretty closely with the weapons schools. So the Air Force with their weapons school and us with Top Gun. So we work to see like, these are the things, the cool toys that we have coming down the pipeline. And we want to see if we can turn these into viable tactics. Like, where are you guys planning on going the next 5 years? They're busy enough trying to develop tactics right now. They can't necessarily be in every single one of these VTCs every week, which talks about all the different cool toys we have coming down the pipeline. So they give us a lot of trust and like saying, hey, this is where we want to go. These are the things that we need to work. If there's a big decision making, like bring us in the loop, let us know what's going on. But like right now, you guys kind of have the reins and you take this and run with it, which is pretty empowering, to be honest. Like that they're busy enough doing their thing and they trust that you're going to kind of steer the program towards the direction that they also want. And then they also want to hear feedback, because if they've got stuff that they're writing tactics expecting certain capabilities and maybe those don't pan out the way they're expecting, they want to hear pretty earlier on that, hey, this thing that you think might be helping you out down the pipeline, it might not actually be what you expect it's going to be. Or if it's going to work, maybe it's working a slightly different way, and this is something you better be aware of, so you can either write tactics accordingly or write recommendations that say, hey, don't use it this way or something bad might happen. So I will say that coming from a fleet, I had absolutely no idea what OT was or what they actually filled. Every once in a while, you got to see somebody who said they came from VX9, but they were a little bit more, I wouldn't say cryptic, but just like, we got to play with some cool missiles, like drop some bombs. It was a good time and we got to do different things, but we're in China Lake, California. Like, who knows where China Lake, California is? But I think it would have been interesting. It definitely wouldn't have changed my mindset because I loved where I came from. But it would have been better if we, as an OT community, would reach out to a fleet and talk to people as like, hey, this is an option. Think about it. Like, I know right now you're deep in tactics and this is where you should be. But as you get to your end of your sea tour, think about this as an option. If you don't want to be an instructor or you don't want to go back to the training command, like this is a pretty decent option where we need people that want to be here, because it's kind of unique in that there's not a lot of hand holding in there. So people who show up in OT, if they want to do work, kind of sky's the limit. Like, you can pile on as many different projects as you want. You can get involved with many different agencies wanting to work with your particular platform or your system. And they kind of, at least the leadership that was in place while I was there, they let you run with it, which is awesome. And what you really wouldn't want is we wouldn't want to have somebody just assigned to an OT squadron that just like, I don't want to be here. You're not helping out the enterprise there. But it's kind of luck of the draw right now, and because they just don't talk about the OT side as much. But there are a lot of other things that just like the doors that open up just because you're around there. You work with a lot of different vendors and you get a little cynical on like what has to happen behind closed doors in order to actually make the product that gets to you. And maybe you're a little bit ignorant when you're in the fleet and you're just given a new software and you just like expect it all to work, and you don't recognize all the hard work that was done behind the scenes with like handshake deals of things that made the cut, didn't make the cut. Like, why didn't this make the cut? But when it comes out to like actually giving something out to a fleet, it's rewarding to show them and be like, hey, these are the things that didn't happen because X, Y, or Z, but like you're going to have this capability that's delivered to you and it's going to work. And I don't have the time to tell you how bad it was literally 8 months ago, but you got something that's going to work now, and that's cool.
Okay, so again, broadly speaking, VX9, we're talking about matching those airplanes that the developmental test folks are saying, hey, yep, let's put that fleet aviator in it and go out and do test stuff, and we're matching that with weapons. Some of these weapon systems that are new, some of these weapon systems that are maybe, kind of spiral up process, they get better and better over time. I think one of the great things that's gotten better and better over time is the AIM-9 missile. Hoping maybe you could tell me a story about the Sidewinder.
Yeah, it's been kind of the staple of our IR missile for a while now, and sure enough, it's one of the things that's on the F-35. And we can save a debate for later on whether you want to put an externally mounted missile on a low observable fighter for another day, but it still needs to be tested. It's going to be a missile that we put on the F-35, and myself and another pilot at VX9 had a hand in firing a 9X. It wasn't the first 9X on there, but it is the first of a new tape in the 9X and the first of a new tape in the F-35. So a lot of our testing, we call it regression testing. So things that work in previous software, we need to test again to make sure that it doesn't not work now, right? So you got to make sure that like it's still going to work. Here's something that the F-35 pilot needs to know if they come from the F-18. To launch a missile, you no longer pull a trigger, you push the pickle. So in F-18, you just push the pickle to drop bombs. F-35, it's a weapons consent release switch, whether that's air to air or air to surface. F-18, pull trigger. So here, we need to know that in your current software, when you press that weapons consent release switch, or the pickle, that missile is going to come off and do what you expect it to do every single time. And myself and another pilot, we got to basically take the newest AIM-9X and the newest software that we had in the F-35C and make sure that the thing was working. And the cool thing was, I say cool thing, like they spec this missile to work for a lot ton of AOA and a lot ton of Gs, right? Like this thing needs to be able to turn corners in a dogfight, and the missile needs to go where it needs to go in order to find that person. And in the F-18 side, when you are working towards a deployment, one of the things they have you do is shoot a missile just to say that you've done it. But it's very much a CAN scripted thing of here's a target that's right in front of you. You're flying straight and level. You're going to shoot the missile. It's going to go straight and you're going to check the box and call it good. Well, in the test community, like you got to test those edge cases. And so when that missile is good to X amount of Gs, or that missile is good up to X AOA, we're going to fly it up to that AOA and that G and make sure that that missile comes off and goes where it's supposed to go. So myself and another pilot, we got to do that stuff on the aircraft. And that was one of the more neat things that we kind of played around with, was making sure that that missile came off. And it's funny to think about from a 30,000 foot view is like, oh, just pulling Gs and pickling a missile. That sounds super easy. That's what it's supposed to do. And when you're employing it, yes, that's how easy it should be. But when you throw all these restrictions on, like, hey, this missile, you're launching it over the water, and we got to put a safety box around the water to make sure there's no ships that are around here, the missile's randomly going to fall down and hit somebody, and the target can only be engaged for 6 minutes because it's going to run out of fuel if it has to make one more pass. So you have this one shot, you have to breach this one box. It's the kind of flying that I did not expect to have to do in OT, but it just became hat. You learn, I mean, they teach you in 106 in the F-18 and 125 in the F-35 to always shack your time on target, because like that's what matters for the guys on the ground. And turns out that quality kind of translated super well over into the OT world too, where like you had to be inside this shot box at this exact time with these exact parameters. So you did a lot of building up to that stuff.
Do you have basically like a room, I'm guessing? I'm envisioning in my mind NASA, a control room of people that are watching this happen, and you're not just blasting these missiles off left, right, and center. This is a very specific thing, and they're watching every little bit of your performance. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, as much as I would want to do that and just, guns a-blazing, shoot all the missiles we got all at one time, that would be cool. Everything is very proceduralized because there's data that needs to be collected, and that's arguably, obviously more important. So yeah, you're right. There's definitely a control room. They even call it a control room. That's at Edwards. They've also got one over at Point Magoo, which is normally where we do a lot of our missile shoots, is outside of Point Magoo. And they can even connect both those control rooms together. So we have guys that are sitting in a control room in Edwards, and they are looking at our displays and looking at everything with the missile health as well. They're able to, in real time, analyze everything that's happening. And so for me as a pilot, I kind of looked at it as like I am just driving the ship to a spot that the engineers have designed that they want to test. Here's like a plug for the communication between the flight test engineers and the pilots is paramount in that they all know what the overall objective is, because where we make our money is when things inevitably start falling apart. We can try and find a way to still get to that data point that might take them a little bit longer to figure out or just isn't naturally intuitive. Like from flying for thousands of hours, these airplanes, we got a pretty good idea on what we can do and how we can still get a mission accomplished. And as long as I understand what your data points are, I can make, in my mind, savvy recommendations to help that process down and not just lose an entire day, especially when you pay for an entire range and you launch range clearing airplanes, you have all these hours, like hard times to find stuff. You want to take every advantage. And in my mind, if we lose a test point because a pilot doesn't react to a situation in a reasonable way, that's a huge failure. And it's a frustrating experience when that happens.
So lots of work going into it. You, I was about to say pulled the trigger. You pressed the consent switch.
Yeah.
The missile came off the jet. Did it do what you were hoping it would do?
Yeah, 100%. It was.
I mean, like you said, it was an edge case. So this is not just straight and level, Sunday drive. You're putting the airplane to the test. You're putting the missile to the test. I'm guessing that's probably a pretty impactful feeling that everything worked, the team worked, and you're giving back good data to the folks that need it.
No, it's always a better experience when things work as intended, and you collected all the data to prove so. It's not as cool as much as a pilot wants it to be cool, where fire a missile, goes to a target, in some cases explodes the target. Like I see it, but they're like, oh yeah, we didn't have any of the data on that one. And then it's cool. It's impressive. It happens like real-time validation. I got the thing. It's like, well, did everything happen appropriately, or are we worried that there's going to be a case that is not going to make this happen? Maybe you got lucky. Maybe this is a 10% thing. So in our case, it was good. The thing worked. We had all the data we needed to. And for the most part, like that's been the case. But there's been a lot of days where it's like hard fighting in the trenches to try and find the data, or it doesn't work fully up. And there's alternate data that we can collect and still get the most out of the flights. Some of the things to mention that's something I never thought about when I showed up to the OT world is we have what they call ITVs. Again, more acronyms. Integrated Test Vehicle, something instrumented test vehicle. They are a missile, but without the actual motor. The motor that's in there is replaced with telemetry. And it's the same software that's in that missile. So we can actually simulate an AMRAAM. We can simulate an A9X. inside just this training round, we can test everything inside the aircraft, right? So when an AMRAAM comes off, the radar actually data links to the missile, and it starts to update a projected impact point where that missile is going to go. And then it gets basically to a handoff point, and the missile takes over with its eyes and consummates the intercept on its own. We take that for granted when we go and we test for tactics and training, right? Like we have obviously simulated modes inside the airplane where I can just turn sim mode on, press the pickle or pull the trigger, and I watch the little flyout show up on my screen and goes to the target, and then miss flyout disappears, and I call the kill, and then the guy goes away, bad guy goes away, and then we reset and do another fight or something along those lines. And that's cool. But who validates that everything that just happened is actually going in the missile itself? And it wouldn't be the first time where they, release new software in a missile or new software in an airplane, and one of these steps becomes gooned up, right? Let's say we consent to release the missile, it comes off, but the radar doesn't data link to it at all for whatever reason. I know where the guy is at, but I'm just not sending the data link up to the missile. Or maybe I fox the missile and it just doesn't go anywhere at all. There's no data link sync at all, or attempts to data link, but the data link sync is messed up. We find these things by using ITVs before we actually launch real missiles and waste much more money. So we can go out in the range, we can fly up and down, and wouldn't be surprised if somebody's American Airlines flight, whatever, coming down from San Francisco going down to LA has been part of one of our test missions of flying an ITV and shooting a missile towards them and making sure that the data link and everything is working appropriately.
Digitally, for clarity. There's no rocket fuel in that motor.
Nope. but everything's a fair game and target. I mean, generally we use our own targets because we can put them in parts of skies that we're trying to test certain cases for. But it is funny, some of the airspace abuts right where we're doing our testing for. And if your target aircraft falls out for a maintenance issue, you're still trying to find a way to grab some of that data. And one of them is we'll just find a guy who's flying near the border of the 2508 and we'll work that way too.
Okay, well, you talked about pressing the consent switch for more than just air-to-air ordnance. Anything air-to-ground that you had a chance to be a part of? Yeah,
we actually played around with the laser JDAM and the JDAMs, GB54, specifically the 500-pound JDAM and the laser JDAM was in our wheelhouse.
Joint direct attack munition?
Yep.
Okay, so GPS guided?
Yeah, exactly. So your kind of standard flavor GPS guided weapon, they started off with the 2,000 pounder in the F-35, and so the 500 pounder came later. So we were actually using the laser JDAM for the first time, and we got a pretty interesting story about that one where they brought it out to Edwards, and we got to go out there and drop a laser JDAM guided by an F-18. So they were using their AT FLIR up in China Lake, and we dropped a laser JDAM on a remote control car essentially in the middle of the desert there, and got to launch that thing off. So that was the first time that we operationally launched a laser JDAM, and that was in the OPT community, which is a pretty cool experience to go for. And we subsequently learned there are certain things that you have to have set up correctly in it. So the F-18 uses what they call CADs inside the pylon. It is explosive like shotgun shells that literally...
cartridge actuated device.
Hey, there you go. Nice, yeah. Perfect. So they will basically punch off the bomb that's on the pylon and get it away from the aircraft and start flying down. The F-35 doesn't use CADs. It uses a pneumatic pressure system. So we've basically got a buildup of pressurized air. There's a pump that's inside the weapons bay, and it basically builds up pressure, and it uses pneumatic pressure just to punch the bombs off. And you've got a pressure setting for the front and a pressure setting for the back. You've got high and low, I think, and high and low. Man, I didn't research my answers on some of the questions that were going here. But what we learned was one of the pubs for the GB38, so the 500-pound non-laser variant, was wrong. And it gave us the wrong pitch valve setting in the front, where it was high pressure, and low in the back. And what that did was it actually pushed down the nose too hard. So when the bomb came out of the weapons bay, it came out damn near 90 degrees. Yeah.
Thinking of this Vietnam era A4, there's the classic video of a store coming off and coming back and hitting the tail. Hopefully not that dramatic for y'all, but it's not a good thing if it comes off in a way it's not anticipated.
Yeah, and correct. And so this is where trying to work equally between DT and OT and try and find the right speed, it's probably not somewhere we wanted to be close to. Now, did it get close at all to hit an airplane? No, it didn't. But that is one of those realms that we should have caught something. You shouldn't get bad information on how to load this weapon. But it's a good thing that we went out and loaded it with the settings that were provided to us, because that was going to be shipped to the fleet the exact same way. And that's not what you want. So it was interesting to look at, and is all good because, nothing happens from it. But that is the nature of doing things from sometimes the first time.
You mentioned Edwards. We haven't really unpacked Det Edwards and flying around the Edwards complex there. It's some incredible airspace. I've been close to it at Mojave, not really in it. But what was it like flying at Edwards Air Force Base?
It's interesting. It is out there in the middle of nowhere, and quite literally, you say that about every Navy base, but Edwards, good Lord. You get off of Highway 14 in Roseman, California, and you drive 14 miles east until you get to the main gate. And then you drive another 8 miles after the main gate to get to the actual complex of the base, and another 2 miles to get to the airfield. So it is quite literally in the middle of the desert and is more secluded than other stuff, which is probably for a reason. Maybe they kind of established a test center there out in the middle of nowhere where it's harder to take pictures, something along those lines. But there's a lot of history, obviously, it's there. The Air Force Test Pilot School is there, and all the history it associated with it. I remember going out to, they have basically a north base, a main base, and a south base. I don't know the history of if they used them all at the same time. The north base is still active. The main base is obviously the big one, and the south base is primarily like, I'll call it GA, not really GA, but they have a aero club that's down there. So the runway is still active, but it's not managed by the tower. However, you have to advise the tower and all the stuff that happens down there. So routinely, there'll be 172s or other kind of GA airplanes, helicopters that are flying on South Base. You'll hear them on the frequency talking, but they're not integrating with the actual like main base. Down on South Base is where they actually launched the X-1 for the first time. So they have the actual pit where they basically mated the X-1 up to the carrier craft. And that pit is still there with a plaque and everything on there. So it's cool to go down there and see all the different history. Not to mention that NASA still has a footprint there, and you can see where Neil Armstrong had like his lander as he was flying around and had to eject out in the middle of the dry lake bed. So there's a lot of cool history. I'll tell you, I wish that they were still flying the shuttle, and it could add some opportunities to see like the shuttle coming in and landing there, because you still see a lot of the markings where they had the lead-in markings for the shuttle are out there still. So it's a cool spot. The other neat thing is, of course, since the area is restricted, like it's very easy to work with. No longer do you have to fly to get to your airspace. You launch and you're already inside your airspace right then. And that just does wonders for getting as much test done as possible. And not to mention all the different range assets that they have available to them is something that like you'd have to travel to Edwards to get. But because it's right there in their backyard, it's a pretty cool spot.
So we're talking about the special airspace at Edwards. Kind of things are happening in a little bit of a vacuum. That's good because you want that for test. Is there ever maybe an example where that test mindset, maybe working more with the fleet or kind of pointing the weapons a little bit more towards the folks that are eventually going to use them? Anything that you had in your experience at VX9, Det Edwards?
Yeah, that was a really cool thing about being an OT is you get those both, like you said, we had a sanitized environment that we were able to like do a crawl, walk, run with new weapons, new tactics. Well, not really tactics, but new things to play with. And we would start small, make sure they were just integrated with the software inside the airplane and then work off to something else. But we had opportunities to basically put ourselves in as best as possible of a realistic scenario that you could possibly ask for. And one example being Northern Edge. We actually went up there twice my time that I was at VX9. So we basically take 5 or 6 of our jets and we'd bring them up to Fairbanks. And we would take part in Northern Edge, which is like a 2-week-long exercise where we, as best as possible, simulate conflict that we'd expect to be faced up against. And so we play with all the toys that we expect to have, and it's the best possible surrogate for like how the aircraft's going to perform right now in a RF rich, target rich kind of mindset. Everybody up there, target rich is probably a flag word with Top Gun that's out there, but you put up a lot of airplanes in one piece of sky and suddenly that thing that works pretty reliably in an isolated environment tends to have some issues. So as one of the cool things about being in the OT community is you get to go up in these large force exercises, go to some pretty cool places. Alaska, Fairbanks, it doesn't sound super awesome, but like, good Lord, that was awesome flying. Got a lot of good data points. And it's also in the middle of the spring, so it wasn't actually cold when we were up there. It was phenomenal. Super long days and daylight, but there's a lot of cool things. And you can also make a lot of decent contacts with other people that are testing their own stuff. So you can kind of accelerate a lot of the connectivity issues by reaching out to your counterparts and other units with other type model series that are trying to play with the same kind of toys. And you can kind of head off some problems instead of waiting for like the next time you do this next year. You maintain that contact and kind of work things into other aspects. We also did something similar in Hawaii for Pacific Edge. So kind of a similar thing, but done in Hawaii. So we took our airplanes out to Hawaii and did the exact same thing out there where we get to test the current software that we got. Well, I say current, is the software that's going to be released next in the F-35. And we get to play with the new toys that are in there and kind of massage some of the stuff that it's a good litmus test for if we took this thing out right now, how's it going to handle a giant environment with all this other stuff that's out there?
Did you get to take one of the jets across to Hawaii?
Yeah, sure did.
What's it like tanking all the way across? I say across the pond, but a decent chunk of water.
Without looking into the flight planning at first, you think that there's like a point of no return. Turns out with the fuel tanks of an F-35, there actually is not a single point in that entire flight where you can't get back to land somewhere. That being said, the more airplanes you put on a tanker, the more you play this like musical chairs game of who's in the hose right now kind of mindset. But with the fuel bags that we do have, you could go away from Hawaii all the way to the point, and then eventually San Francisco is your divert. I think it's actually whatever air base is out there. That's we continue on to go out that way or come back. So there was never really a dead man zone, assuming you have pressurization, everything's working okay. Because there's always stories about weird stuff happening, and now you're in no man's land.
How long of a flight was that?
5.5 hours.
Is it a 5.5? Comfortable cockpit to sit in for 5.5 hours?
It's big enough. Yeah. And for some of our combat missions, which I've been in the aircraft as long as 8.5 hours, like that was not too bad. 5.5 is okay, especially when you move those foot pedals forward and now you stretch your legs out. So it works out. Okay.
Pedal packs and snacks and all that, and you're good to go.
The tanking's okay. It's not super fun. You probably hear Navy pilots talk about KC-135s and the Iron Maiden. I would say maybe a little bit harder in the F-35 than it was in the F-18. In fact, not quite related, but We used to have some issues with the probe in the F-35 decoupling from baskets in an F-18. And that was something that we actually worked with the DT community pretty closely out in Pax River to categorize the scenarios where this was happening more often and try to come up with mitigating techniques and procedures. So we work with DT and their assets. They're instrumented at ARS. So like they have an ARS that can actually like register the latch force required on these, like all these things that you don't even think about, but in some world need to be tested. And those assets are spread all over the place, in this case, Pax River. So we need to go out to Pax River because we had some instrumented airplanes also just by nature of being in test from an F-35 side, which is slightly unique. Not the VX-9 F-18s don't necessarily have them. So we're in a pretty odd spot where we can help out a little bit on some data messages under the hood, we call it, but we got to play with them too.
It's hard to pick just one flight, one sortie, maybe one test point. Is there one that you could look back on and think, man, it all coalesced, it all came together, it really summarized your time flying the airplane and flying as part of Det Edwards?
There are a couple of them that do pretty good
We
stuff.
can take more than one story. That works.
Yeah, there'd be stories that we take offline, but it was a rewarding community. And like the stories that we talked about are, in my mind, run-of-the-mill things, but they need to be done right, because even giving somebody a awesome weapon that doesn't work is a much worse spot than it sounds terrible to say, but a upper mediocre weapon that works every single time and is reliable. Because we train for consistent, repeatable habit patterns, something that Top Gun will talk about. And that doesn't necessarily encompass the weapons because you expect them to work. And so if we aren't doing our job in OT, you're going to pass off trash. And when you press that pickle button and nothing happens, or something happens that you're not expecting, that's a real bad spot real quick. So a lot of our job is to make sure that when we give you the new software, that we tell you everything that we know is potentially, I'm going to say broken, but maybe doesn't work as you expect, but this is the things that you do to mitigate it. Or we don't make recommendations as a test community. We save that for Top Gun, but we definitely make our assessments and what we would talk about. It's something that we'd bring up in a test report. It's kind of a weird, nuanced world, but we're not going to tell you what you can and can't do with your aircraft, but we're sure as hell going to inform you about the two different scenarios.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Like you said, Top Gun, the folks at Test Pilot School that ended up going on to do the developmental test. It's kind of cool that you have that. It's almost like the three legs of a pyramid triangle, whatever you want to call it. Apparently, I don't know my geometry today. But yeah, if there's not smart folks on, not even just the military side and the civilian side, in all three of those places, it's going to fall apart. And you need intelligent people working with the airplane at all those levels, or all this stuff is just looks good in an air show. You know, loops to music, but that's about it. So that's really, really awesome. Well, as we kind of wrap this up, to use your term, bring the ship into the shore, I don't think I've asked about your call sign. I'm embarrassed to say I don't think I know your call sign. What is your call sign and what's the story behind it?
My call sign's Bernie. It's a pretty generic call sign, is a story down in Key West of, it was my wedding down, so 02 to 03, and there's a couple other guys.
What's a wedding down? I don't think we've unpacked that.
Oh, really? Yeah, wedding down being like, so the first time you promote the first paycheck, you take the difference of the money that you've made more. So in this case, when you turn to 03, you basically take all that extra money you made in your first 03 paycheck and you throw it towards a bar tab. And there are a couple other people that were the same timeline as me, so we all had like, I think 3 or 4 people were throwing the money down in this bar tab. I just straight up fell asleep during dinner, and I am the one that's supposed to be paying it because we're putting it all into one account and it's coming out of my pocket. So they can't take me home because then no one's going to pay for dinner. So they do the whole weekend at Bernie styles and put like sunglasses on and put me in a corner, and I become the guy that's like at dinner with the whole squadron, but I'm just asleep, passed out in the corner. So it became the weekend at Bernie's, essentially, is what that worked out to.
Fantastic. That's a great story.
Yeah.
Well, again, Bernie, thank you for taking so much time. Thanks for making the schedule line up. I know you're a busy dude these days with the second career or third career. I don't even know what career it is now, but thank you again for making all this work. So I want to end, obviously, with that gratitude. And also, you get the last word. Anything maybe I didn't ask or anything you want to say, it's over to you.
Well, I'm very happy that this was worked out. And maybe there's going to be something else for the next career that shows up, or other questions. If you want me to debunk some F-35 things, I can't promise you I'll be able to do anything smartly anymore after I'm going to be outside of that program. The only thing I'll leave with, and maybe it didn't come up, or we didn't come up in conversation, is the difference in mindsets between the Navy and the Air Force and the test community, because I never really knew of the test world when I showed up. The Navy and the Air Force do it slightly differently. When the Air Force decides that you're going to be a test pilot, you stay in a test track and you don't go back to an operational world. The Navy is not that way, in that you go to test pilot school, you do your test tour, and then after that you go back operational, and then maybe you pick up AEDO and you stay in a test world that way. But like if the Navy had their way, you'd stay operational, you go the whole way. So I would say challenge to anybody though, it's maybe there should be an open discussion on, is there a better way that the Navy does it or a better way that the Air Force does it? We take all this time developing you into a test pilot. And for me, learning a new airplane, it took me about a year before I started feeling comfortable that the things that I think are wrong with the airplane are actually wrong and not just my misunderstandings. Now that's specific to just the F-35, but should we be better off by sending somebody into an OT world and then letting them stay in some kind of test mindset and maybe move them around a little bit for different test coasts or different things? But do we put them back into a fleet because I would argue that the best testers that we have, the Navy would be better served if they stayed in a test world and stayed there longer. But we never got around to talking about that one. It's one of the things that I left with being that, like, man, it took a long time to feel like you're not even competent in what we're doing, but at least making a difference in a positive direction. And then the instant that, like, I feel I'm starting to make that corner, Navy's like, oh, ready to go back to a fleet. And that was part of the decisions I'm getting now was like, I don't really want to go back to that operational mindset. I would think about staying here and test.
I'm glad you brought it up. Maybe that is, like you said, maybe that's something we can hopefully reattack another time and kill some more F-35 myths in the future. But that's awesome, man. I think it's so important that a lot of times people think, I don't think you're criticizing anyone, but right, maybe that critical comment or that critical thought is so important because you love the organization. You love what you've done clearly. And it's those people that have seen it and done it, that feedback is probably, I would argue, the most important to get to the people that need to hear it. And like you said, that's a decision point on staying or going. We need all the good people we can to stay. So maybe hopefully someone will hear that. But
yeah, totally agree.
Thanks again. Maybe we'll reattack this sometime soon with a little bit more. But again, I appreciate all your time.
Thank you. Congratulations on the competency thing there. Yeah, and safe travels back up to the new duty station.
I'm incredibly competent in the eyes of the FAA. So nailed it.
We all are.
Thanks, Andy.
See ya.
Thanks, as always, for taking the time and tuning in to Safe on Deck. Hope you enjoyed this episode. It shouldn't need to be said, but just in case, I'll say it. The views and opinions presented on Safe on Deck are my own and those of my guests, and do not represent the official policy or position of the Department of Defense, the Department of the Navy, or its components. Be well, blue skies, and fly safe out there. See you next time. PC idle, wings level, deploy over Safe on Deck.